Good afternoon, everyone. I hope you had enjoyed for lunch. So my name is Guan Long, and associate professor from UQ. So we're gonna have the next keynote from Dr. Nick Tate. Nick is the president of the Australian Computer Society, ACS, and a senior executive with a strong background in IT and cybersecurity. He has considerable experience as a company director and at the level of CIO, and has been a CEO. Nick has 20 years experience as a company director in 16 Australian and 2 US companies. He has a PhD in cybersecurity, is an adjunct professor here at UQ, and a member of the James Cook University Council. So from 2016 and 17, he was CEO of BCI Technology. He is also director of APAC project to establish an ICT skills framework for the Asia Pacific region. So without further ado, Nick, please.
Thank you very much, Guangdong. I'm just making sure that I was told to center for the camera here. So I've done it, I think, roughly right. And I'd like to start by thanking Ryan, who contacted me while I was in Scotland to let me know would I come and have a chat here today. And so I was of course delighted. And if Ryan calls, I'm of course happy to oblige at any point. So that's not a problem. I should say, and Stuart has promised. He promised not to heckle at this point. I should say that I'm an Irish citizen, and one of my, one of the things that I think many people may have heard of Irish sayings is it's perhaps sometimes regaled as a joke that a tourist goes up to someone in Cork and says, "How should I get to Dublin?" And the response from the local in Cork is, "Well, I wouldn't start from here if I were you." And that's a very Irish approach to this. And one of the things is I actually was driving through Ireland, and Stuart may know this well, and found myself at the Barack Obama Plaza, which is like a motorway service cafe somewhere south of Birr Castle in Ireland. And I actually heard someone asked and got exactly that response to someone in the cafe at the plaza. And quite honestly, if you ask me now, well, how should we secure our activities on the internet? I'd have to say to you, well, I really wouldn't start from here if I were you, because looking at all of the positions we have, frankly, after all, we are one of the few industries built on technical deficiencies. And that's not a criticism of products, it's a criticism of many things, including protocols. And at one time, I had the opportunity of chatting to a guy called Vince Cerf, who's one of the co-inventor of the TCP/IP internet. He was here in Brisbane at Customs House doing a presentation, and it was interesting to talk to him. When they early on looked at the TCP/IP protocol, they realized that it was going to be deficient in a number of areas. They weren't silly. They realized it was deficient in not having the right address space. Well, of course, IP version 6, as you'll know, was attempting to solve that. One day, everybody will implement it. But right now, the thing that perhaps at the time was they wanted to make it more secure and use encryption. And the NSA at the time, the National Security Agency of the US, prevented them because encryption at that point was tightly controlled by some of the US agencies and military. And the fact is that we built an industry, it's there, but we built an industry now on many of the deficiencies that have come from the very start of the process. And I wish he was here, but Bill Cayley, an eminence grise from in security here in Queensland, when you ask him, he makes that point so often, and I should attribute it to him. So just briefly, on key. I think we might need another one. Let's have a look. Can I do it there? Oh, okay. On that one. Oh, sorry. here we are, unraveled it. One of the things I should say just about me is I'm obviously, as you can see, very old. There are advantages and disadvantages to this. I started programming in a commercial program in 1969. So that tells you I must be very old. And that's the computer that I was starting on. I was at school, I might add, even though it wasn't that much later, but it's still a long time ago. And what that does is there are many disadvantages of getting old, and don't worry, I'm not going to detail them to you today, but there are some advantages in that I've been very fortunate in my career to see many of the inventions, many of the changes that have occurred in IT, and in cybersecurity. When I started, there were no PCs, mobile phones, the term cybersecurity hadn't been invented, and the internet effectively wasn't there. The World Wide Web certainly hadn't been invented. So as an opportunity, it's allowed me to live through many of these changes and to be involved in IT and cybersecurity. And having started out as a physicist with physics and astrophysics and maths at university, I spent a lot of time working in anti-missile and missile systems in the Royal Navy in the UK. And I also spent quite a while in investment banks, mostly in London. I was CIO of a couple of them, but there was a lot of development going on. It was a very fast-paced time, and it allowed a lot of interest. One of the interesting things, which I'll mention a bit later, in terms of how to deal with crises, was that I was working for a bank called the United Bank of Kuwait in London at the time when Kuwait was invaded in the Gulf War. This gave some difficulty, but it gave me quite a lot of experience on how to deal with crises and others, and I'll explain a bit about that later. It's in here. I was director of Alcerta. Not some of David's here, but I was director of Alcerta for about 11 years, and so and therefore have some experience at the UQ and was CIO or IT director here at UQ for some time after working previously at Macquarie Bank. Now, I'm not going to. Sorry. There we are. That's it, got it. Okay, I am not going to sort of just dwell on the past, so don't worry. I'm not going to go down that approach. What I am going to talk about is try and look at some of the issues in the past. So I'm going to look at some of the things that I've seen as we apply them to some of the challenges we have in cybersecurity more generally. I'm not talking about individual research challenges. I'm talking more generally challenges. One of the things that in February this year, I had the opportunity to attend the Prime Minister's Roundtable on cybersecurity, which was an interesting experience. And it's where this document, you'll see the cover of it on the, I presume, the left on your side there. And indeed, UQ put in a response to this. I'm pretty certain Ryan did, and I did on behalf of the Australian Computer Society. But there was a greater discussion going on a number of the challenges in cybersecurity at the actual meeting itself. And so what I'm going to do is take a few of those. You can't take all of them, but take a few of them and talk about some of them. And it was an interesting meeting. There was this Prime Minister, of course. He did turn up, and the Minister of Home Affairs, and several departmental heads, some of whom's departments I can mention, and not all. And there were a number of people from associations and other related bodies, like the President of the Law Society of Australia. So they were trying to get together a clear group of people to say, what are these challenges? What should we do? And the mission really was to say, what should the strategy be through to 2030? And it makes sense, though perhaps in my view, and others are very welcome to challenge it, but I think that's probably too short a horizon for some of the challenges that we've got. But sometimes it's difficult for governments to do horizons which are much longer than that. So let's whoops. Try the next one. So there were many things discussed there. I've just got a very few there, and some of them we've seen in headline press. So, for example, there's a lot today to do with legislative reform, and you'll not be surprised that the government was interested in doing some of those, but some of them are more perhaps controversial than others. So one of the questions that was answered in this strategy document is, should we ban the payments for ransomware. I'll come on to that later because there's some interesting answers you might think. What should we do about strengthening the director's responsibility in companies? You've seen Medicare, you've seen Medicare, Medibank, you've seen Optus, you've seen there are many others. It's not just those two, many others, where it's clear that preventable accidents in cybersecurity have occurred. And the question is, do we have the right mechanism for regulation for doing that? Do we have the right regulation and methods for notifying incidents? The federal government was pretty honest in saying it didn't have as much, didn't have that as well nailed down as it would like to do so. And I think that was good because we started from a position of reasonable honesty as to where we go. And of course, if that didn't, and I'm sure it does now, but if that didn't cover the sort of things that Rob was talking about earlier in terms of the state ones, it would be a fairly useless arrangement at the time. So there are a number of those things. There are also various things about how the government should address in more detail cyber incidents, how we should do the post-consequence review management, and what should happen if people haven't done what they should do in some of these areas. These are all very interesting things, but it was very useful for the government to be coming and asking these questions in order to put together the strategy. I'm sure they've done that separately, of course, and I would hope they have too, with the state governments and the territory governments and with a number of other agencies. But it was a very good, I think, very useful to come out and say, how do we do this and how should we do it? And there were lots of them. It's a busy slide and there were 26 pages in the document if you didn't get to read it, and it's not everybody's bedtime reason. So the question then is really, well, taking some of these issues, some of the things that came out of it were, what about professionalism? So I'm talking here about how we deal as cybersecurity. Have we got a profession? In which case, how should we deal professionally, and what are the issues with being professional? As you'll know from the Guangdong's kind introduction, I'm the president of the Australian Computer Society. So we have to think quite a lot about how we deal with professionalism in our profession, not just in cybersecurity, but of course in IT as a whole. And if you wanted to go and find it, you can find lots of definitions, and I won't bore you with all of them. If you went to the Australian Council of Professions, you'll find that a profession is a disciplined group of individuals who adhere to ethical standards and who hold themselves out as and are accepted by the public as possessing special knowledge and skills in a widely recognized body of learning derived from research, education, and training at a high level. And so the first thing that's emphasized there actually is ethics. And when we come to look at how we deal with professionalism, one of the things we have to say to ourselves is, let's talk a bit about ethics. And that's an interesting topic. The reason it is how do you determine that someone will behave ethically? After all, one of the questions that was posed was, aren't we teaching people all the skills in cybersecurity to defend, which are not too dissimilar to the skills you might use to attack? And how far do we ask people, how far are we responsible to behave ethically? A good story behind that would be one of the things that we did when I was director of OSCE was set up a conference, the OSCE conference, which attracted some very interesting people. One of which, one year, was a gentleman who I think was we might call him a sort of greyish hat hacker. Not black, not white, maybe greyish. He went by the name of Simple Nomad. And I think his name was probably Mark Lovers, but I'm not going to go there. But I don't know how he got into Australia, but I don't think it would have been a passport saying Simple Nomad at the Australian border. Coming in, but one of the interesting things he was talking about that was he I think was someone who didn't attack systems, and that was very helpful. We wouldn't have put him on the OSCE conference if we felt he was. But at the end of the day, he was talking in one of his presentations next door, by the way, to the FBI, one of the serious FBI people. He was talking about how difficult it was for people to understand whether some of the other people with cybersecurity training were actually behaving as they should. And he gave an example of going to a company that wanted to recruit him. So he went to the company, and the head of the head of cybersecurity of the company, who knew him, took him round and introduced him to all the people on the floor. And the person who was introducing him said, "Well, we've got fabulous procedures for checking whether people are going to behave ethically or whether they are, if you like, not doing things which they shouldn't do." And he got up on the floor and he could just see this person definitely wasn't someone you would want to trust ethically. Another one over there was clearly an actual hacker. And the problem he had was, he said, my ethical dilemma at the time was, do I tell the guy that his procedures aren't working and he's got all these goes? And he said, no, I gave up and I just didn't take the job. But the problem is that it's very hard, isn't it, to know that someone's going to behave appropriately. After all, we know, I make no invitation, just in case there are lawyers in the room. I know there are law students in the room, but there are some consulting firms who may not have behaved entirely honourably with government information recently. And there's, we know that that's the case. How do you, in our firm, how do you do that? And the question is that there are lots of codes of ethics and lots of professions, and associations have these. Our problem, and I think the government's problem, is going to be, how do we enforce that? If somebody transgresses those, what are we going to do about it? Just say, oh, we're terribly sorry. In the same, I worked for a company, and there was an office in Dublin one time. Sorry, Stuart, I'm not picking. Honestly, I'm not. The office in Dublin one time, and I went over, and the guy, there was one of the team over there, not my team, wasn't there when I went one time. And I said, well, where is he? And they said, oh, he's out taking a driving test. Okay. I said, but isn't it, I've seen him drive into the office on his own quite a bit. Isn't that a problem? And they said, oh, no, he's failed it 10 or 12 times, the test, but he still comes in because he needs to get to the office. And I said, well, don't the police have a problem with that in Dublin? And I said, oh no, it's sort of understood that it's okay to drive it, as long as he doesn't take someone else, they won't worry too much. The bottom line is, I don't know what would have happened if he had an accident. I hate to think. By the way, he failed the test again that time, but it only takes a few times for you to turn a blind eye to some of these things before the whole trust that you've got that someone's behaving ethically goes away. And that's one of the problems that we're going to see, I think, as a profession in dealing with it. It's one of the ones we have to grapple with a bit when we're looking as a professional association. And of course, the other, I'll make sure I do the right one now this time. The other issue is skills. How do you know? I mean, we know that we don't have enough skilled people in cybersecurity. That's clear, and I'll show you some figures later. But the fact is, how do you know that you have the people with the right skills? You've got fabulous training here. Let me say, for Ryan and Michael's benefit, and it's not just for Michael's benefit. This is fabulous training that's going on. It really is excellent here at UQ Cyber. We need a lot more of it. Not in competition with you, Ryan, of course, but a lot more of it. The trouble is, there's people in the wider industry. I'm not talking here in the wider industry with a plethora of degrees, frameworks, qualifications, badges, micro credentials, and who knows. Those are the start, and that's not to say any of them are good, bad, or indifferent. They all have appropriate places in the system, but actually they're only a start. How do you know not only that those are the right badges, micro credentials, degrees, whatever it may be, how do you know that they're keeping up to date? Because you don't need me to tell you that what you get told, what you got taught 4 years ago, may not be as relevant this year and next year and onwards as it was at that point. You've got to keep up to date as a professional. So all of these are an issue that I think we have to address. And what I think is coming out of and the reason I'm talking about this is, what do you think governments are going to do about it? Because that's the government that realise that these are issues. I'm talking about I'm not in any way talking for the Queensland government, Rob, just want to make it, of course, clear. But I'm just talking about the message we were getting back from the federal government, that they need to find some way of being confident that we have trust in the ethics and the skills of the people who are cybersecurity professionals. And you might say, well, this is new, this is a problem. Well, it isn't new, actually. If I can get to the next one, whoop, wrong one, sorry. I double-clicked it. There we are. It's happened a bit before. One day, but a few years ago, barbers and surgeons were the same profession. You whipped in for a haircut and you could get something chopped off or taken out at the same time. And there was a problem after a while because the wrong bits were being chopped off or people were dying, and that was considered very poor form, die in a barber's shop as they did these things. So there was a problem at this point, and eventually somebody said, we've got to do something about this. And the government said, we're going to start regulating. We're going to have to register people. At that point, it turned out, and it wasn't until 1800, I know that's a couple of hundred years ago, before they thought of doing that. So they separated them out and said, you're either a barber or you're a surgeon. Okay. And then about 1830, they said, okay, let's regulate it a bit more. You're going to have a medical degree to be a surgeon. Prior to that, you didn't have to. You could just turn up and do surgery if you wanted to. Now, there are some analogies. This is a long time ago, but there are some analogies with what's happening. It is important to consider regulation. The government is going to have to consider that, and it's going to registration. Different words here. We're going to use it, but I think we're going to find that that's one of the outcomes that we're going to get. And as cybersecurity professionals, that's something we need to be aware of, think through, and I hope be prepared to contribute to when it comes to what needs to be done. Now, you may remember that I think it was about 2018, there were some slight problems in Sydney and Melbourne. If there were any problems about this in Brisbane, it was well hidden. So that's good. Not that it's easy to hide blocks of flats falling down, which is what was going on. These were, this is in, I think it was called Mascot Tower. This one's Opal Towers in Sydney, and there were other ones in Melbourne, but they found huge cracks, and the flats were starting to not work. And surprisingly enough, there was a lot of disappointment in this from the people who were living in the flats, because they were evacuated, or the flat fell down, or bits fell off, and that was really very unhappy. So the governments, the New South Wales and the Victorian governments were quite keen to do something about it. Up till now, as many of you may know, in Queensland, engineers are already required to register. So we have a registered or regulated, however you want to describe it, profession. That was the Queensland. This is from the 1930s from memory. Queensland was the only jurisdiction at that point. After this, Victoria started to register, and New South Wales is looking at it. That seems to take a long while to get there. They're starting to say, when the consequences of what you're doing get worse, think of the medical staff as well, the surgeons, killing too many people as a barber, a certain surgeon. When the consequences get worse, you're going to have to start doing something about it. And I think what I'm suggesting to you, and let's have a debate discussion about it later, we're getting to the point where people are going to start saying, I'm sorry, the consequences are getting too bad, we're going to have to do something. Now, it doesn't mean they're going to regulate all programmers or something like that. I can't imagine a government doing that at the moment, but I can imagine them starting to do that for cybersecurity. I think they will also do it for AI. But whether they'll start with the regulation of people, more likely the regulation of the actual products and services that the software comes out in AI. Interestingly, there is an example of some regulation. Rob may have been in the Queensland government long enough. I wouldn't possibly suggest anything about that, Rob, but there was a many years ago, and I think Stuart may remember it, the Queensland government brought in a security registration act, but it wasn't designed for cybersecurity. It was designed for people who install security systems and other associated activities. And unfortunately, at the time, the way they phrased it, because I think the legal section of the Queensland government wasn't as fully across cybersecurity as it might be, phrased it so that in order to be practicing in cybersecurity, you needed to be registered as a bouncer. Now, obviously, that's a very helpful additional skill if you want to be a bouncer, but it turns out that people were really quite unhappy with that rate. We had to ramp it back. So it just shows that governments are sometimes nervous and reluctant because it's hard to do, and you can understand their reluctance in that. So enough probably on the skills, but I think from what I saw at the that PM's roundtable and others, we're going to see the emerging possibility of regulation. So let's change tack slightly. Who knows the significance of this day? I feel like a university lecturer again. I knew you would know, Ryan. You can't answer. You're all too young, aren't you? Sorry? No. That all right. Oh, you do? The what, sorry? No. Hang on. This is what started CSRC. This is the first, the Morris worm, and that's 1988. That was the first, they were reasonably recorded. That's what you were going to say, Ryan, wasn't it? The first reasonably recorded attack across the internet from one computer to another. And the gentleman who did it, Robert Tappan Morris. He was a student from memory at Cornell, but was sensible enough to launch the attack from MIT's network, not his own university network. And they hadn't really had that. The US had, I don't know why, had set up a Computer Fraud and Abuse Act just a bit beforehand. And he was sentenced, by the way, he was tried and sentenced, but putting this out across the internet the first time. The internet was rather smaller then, obviously, in 1988. And he was given 3 years probation, 400 hours of community service, and a fine of $10,500 US, worth a lot more now, $20,000–$30,000, I suppose now. But it's interesting. This is the incident that led to the founding of CSRC, the first ever CERT that we heard about from David this morning, and indeed ultimately contributed to the founding of CERT here, which was only a few years later. And so what I think is have I got it? Yes, what I think is very interesting is that we've known about vulnerabilities in computer software for 35 years. That was the first time, 35 years ago, that we saw that attack. That's quite a long time to know about that. And according to the latest figures on I think the US government's National Vulnerability Database, it's seeing about over 25,000 reported, I'm sure it's underreported too, vulnerabilities per year. And I have to say to you, and this is something that's going to come out of these things that we have with discussions with government, in what other industry would that level of defect be acceptable? That we've got 25,000 vulnerabilities, plus all the historic ones, a few 100,000 as well. I think we've sorted out the Morris worm now, and it only affected VAX computers. So it's probably not terribly useful now if you wanted to do anything with it. And the problem we have is we know, I mean, if you ever have listened to Bill Cayley, and you should, on cybersecurity, he talks a lot about trusted operating systems. We know that there are trusted operating systems out there. We know how to build some of those. Have we? Not that we have. If people are using them? No, not really. I mean, some are, of course, but in reality, not heavily. So the fact is that it's already thought of that it would slow down innovation if we force people to do that level of trust. It's far too expensive. And now look at the mistakes we're making for people no doubt familiar with the Internet of Things. And if you're not familiar with virtual and augmented reality and how that is developing, it's developing very fast. All of those have started doing the same problem, developing without much regard to cybersecurity. We're making the same argument over and over again. And if you were the government, you might think this, I'm talking about the federal government, well, definitely not talking about the government. If you were the government, you might feel that there's something here that really ought to be dealt with. And it's an interesting problem. It's a challenge for us because really we shouldn't be having that level of defect. And just as an example, oops, sorry, I got on the wrong one there. Just as an example, for those of which there was almost no one old enough here to remember, there was a guy in the US, Ralph Nader, because in the 1960s, cars in the United States, and I suspect here as well, were death traps. You know, there were no crumples, and there was nothing. You were in an accident. That was it. You were likely to lose bits. Presumably the barber servants could come round and sort you out for a while, but you were bound to lose bits at the end of the day. And so there was a lot of fuss. And at that time is many of the major manufacturers said, no, it would be far too expensive for us to build safety into cars. It would be it would cramp our innovation if we had to make cars safe as well as comfortable. So we're just going to make them comfortable and we won't make them safe. And after a while, the government said, well, actually, I'm sorry, the US government, that's not good enough. We're going to require you to make them safe. And if you can make them comfortable as well, that's terrific, but we are going to make them safe. Now, those are the sort of things that we're going to be needing to look out for here. We're going to start getting some regulation, not regulation of individual, registration of individuals. We're going to start, I suspect, not just here, but it's certainly in AI as well. We're going to start seeing some regulation which says we expect certain levels of security. If you look at the NIST, I think it is recommendations for IoT security, they've got a lot of good guidelines, but these are guidelines. These are not yet regulations. I suspect governments generally, and I hope our government is going to do that, but it takes a long time if you don't regulate. For example, IP version 6 have been around 27 years, and I want to correct me on that one. I may not have it right. And is every network currently running IP version 6? Some of them, but there's lots of them none. Every time I go to an APEC meeting, I'm sorry, they go through and they detail the percentage they're getting to with people switching to IPv6. Unless there's some regulation, it's probably going to be very slow. And I suspect we're getting to the point where governments are going to say, well, let's do a bit better than that. So that's another thing that I think is coming out. Just let's switch quickly to thinking about organizational perspective. The government in their paper, the strategy paper, which Ryan responded to, I did, and many others may have done to or contributed to, should the obligations of company directors specifically address cybersecurity risks and consequences? Anyone here a company director? Well done. Here we are. So this affects us then. At the end of the day, the bottom line is, from the ACS perspective, I can't remember what your response was, Brian, but from the ACS perspective, my answer to the federal government was yes. We do need to do better. In my experience, the boards, and I've been on boards for 20 years, the boards that I've been on, it's very hard to focus the director's attention on things which are not forced to focus. I mean, you don't need to force them anymore on finance. They know if they mess up the finance, that the ASIC will be down on them like a ton of bricks. There's no longer any need to force them to focus on workplace health and safety. In Queensland, for those of us who are directors, just to let you know, we're subject to quite stringent workplace health and safety acts, which means we can be criminally prosecuted and go to jail. Don't resign as a director just on that basis, but it is true. So the question is, some of those things people are interested in, it's going to be an interest, it's going to be something we have to do. I think the Australian Institute of Company Directors, which is a great organisation, said, no, directors have enough to worry about. But I don't think it's going to happen. The fact is, at Medibank, for example, as far as I can tell, others please correct me if you like, they lost nearly 10 million data from nearly 10 million customers. That is sensitive, personal medical data, which was very sensitive and very personal in some cases. There were financial consequences for Medibank as a whole. I mean, many tens of millions of dollars in costs to deal with that. That's what they publicly said. I think 45 million roughly was the provision. It may have been more. But the financial consequences for the directors were that they got paid big bonuses. That, I think, is going to be a problem in future. And I suspect that's what's put the federal government is commenting on and why they want to do that. So in other words, they're going to be making, I think there's a push, whether it'll get through this time, I don't know, to say directors ought to be a lot more responsible and take much greater care to make sure that the cybersecurity posture that they're taking, that means checking it occasionally, is actually dealt with. And so it's it's an interesting time to be seeing, because I think some of these are going to generate quite new regulatory requirements or environments for us. What wasn't emphasized very much was how to make sure that organizations are ready to deter or respond to cyber attacks. I'm sure that UQ, the Queensland government, and anyone represented here is already on top of that. But you're all aware, I'm sure, of the tenets of cyber resilience, where I don't need to tell those of you who've been so well educated at UQ Cyber that you need to look at identifying issues, protecting, detecting, responding, recovering. But how many people, how many organizations, I don't mean UQ and the people, the government, big organizations, how many are actually doing that? It requires significant preparation by an organization to do that. And let me, many small and medium enterprises are certainly not up to that or currently able to do it. Let me give you a couple of quick examples. I mentioned, I think earlier, that I was head of IT for the United Bank of Kuwait when Kuwait was invaded. I was in London. I was sort of eating my cornflakes one morning, and for some reason the television was on. I don't know why. And I looked down, and there I saw that those tanks were going across the border. Pictures of them going across the border from Iraq into Kuwait. Now, our bank was based in the UK and regulated there, but effectively a Kuwaiti bank and accounted in Kuwaiti dinars. Its shareholders were all in Kuwait at the time. So I remember saying to my family at the time, I may be a bit late home this evening. Kuwait's been invaded, and we'll have to go and see what happens. Because what actually happened was that there was our shareholders essentially were held at gunpoint in Kuwait City, and there was an abolition of the bank's currency of account. If anyone works here for a bank or has done, but it's quite annoying to have the currency in which you're counting being abolished one night. It really doesn't help. And there were a number of other things that were going on. So however, we had been somewhat prepared. We obviously had read the tea leaves, many of them, and seen that it was possible that Kuwait would be invaded in the Gulf War. And so we'd already identified the issue and built into our systems the ability to swap currency of account with about half an hour. So and we were able to do that. These things we had prepared, and we've done a number of preparations. We found a gentleman called Dr. Solomon, one of the early pioneers in antivirus, who'd sold out, I think, to McAfee after a while. He had a mansion somewhere in the English countryside and had mentally computers and was able to recover. I don't know, he was very good at recovering data. So we'd set up arrangements with him. So as people came across the desert with the large disks, it was a while ago, of their data from their banks, we were able to take it off to get recovered. But if we hadn't been prepared, we'd have been in trouble. Here at UQ, and yes, UQ people here at UQ, many years ago, we had I was a director of IT, and a knock on the door, and somebody said, "There are 2 lawyers here to see you." And that's never a good start to a morning, I've found. It's not that they're about to give you money. They were from the federal court, and they said there's an Anton Pillar order executed against you, and that's done by the federal court in secret. The Anton Pillar was a ship, apparently in Britain, where they wanted to do a quick order to stop people taking evidence away. In this case, I think the ship, and you can use it in technology cases as well. And what was interesting was they said you've got 20 minutes to respond, to show us exactly. They had some information to show us exactly the information. We weren't a target. We were a third party. But what's interesting is if we hadn't been prepared, and we were reasonably prepared, for example, at that point, ITS had a lawyer on staff, and we got straight on and sorted it out. But ultimately, if we hadn't been prepared, we'd have been in a very interesting position. All of this stuff takes preparation, and many organizations are not doing it. And that's, again, an issue that I think the government's going to have to look at in terms of what we do. So, one more. There we go. one of the things, I'm not going to go into it in enormous details, but one of the things that the government talked about was future-proofing technologies, and I think we'll no doubt see more of that. I won't dwell on it, but the prevalence of the harvest now and decrypt later approaches to say, let's get everything we can, maybe some countries more than others. Let's collect as much data as we can that's encrypted now, on the basis that as quantum computing breakthroughs occur, we'll be able to decrypt it and see what everybody said. Means that the government, I think, is asking the problem. It's an interesting research problem. How do you get quantum post-quantum cryptography? And basically, I think the other thing to consider finally is really about the issues, some of the issues and opportunities in cybersecurity. You know, there's a shortage of skills. We all know. I think it's a shortage of skills. The ACS publishes with Deloitte Access Economics this document here, and it's a document talking about how looking at how the economy, the IT economy, is working across Australia. It's got a lot of the information. There's a lot of requirement, which shows a strong demand for all IT skills, not just cybersecurity skills, but cybersecurity skills very particularly. One of the challenges for us in educational areas, how do we meet that demand? If Ryan and Michael decided to increase, even if they decided to increase the number of students, however you did that, coming through UQ Cyber tenfold, the chances are you wouldn't meet the demand. So, and doing that, I leave you to talk to the Vice Chancellor about that at some point. But at some point, if you needed to do that, we actually have to do a lot of other approaches. There's going to be many of the education, many of the university degrees we need to do are important, but retraining will be important. And I think I predict that universities will want to get into the retraining of people who have complementary, sometimes, skills, but sometimes other skills that just need to be trained. We don't all need exactly the same skills. The profession, people starting need some set of skills, and there are people who need enormously technical skills and enormously good legal and policy skills. Finding the right way of dealing with that is going to be, I think, one of the challenges from education, and that again is coming out of that meeting we were looking at seeing how do we meet that particular issue. And so that was, by the way, if you look at that one, that's the most recent of these digital pulses. We need over 1 million technology workers by 2024 and 1.2 million by 2027. We're about 900,000 at the moment. So there's a lot of space. So you're in the right profession in cybersecurity. You're doing the right choice, and that's fantastic for those of you, particularly who are students in it. This is the right approach to be in, but it is, again, one of the challenges that we have to face. Cybersecurity is growing up and maturing, and we have a series of challenges, not just the ones that the government generally are having to grapple with because of the rapid expansion of cybersecurity and the consequences, which are a real problem if we don't deal with some of the issues of registration and regulation and not just guidelines. So I think that's I'm very happy to answer any questions if you are any, or of course you may want to completely challenge everything I've said, in which case I'll get Ryan up to help me as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Nick. Okay, we have some time for questions.
Hello, yes.
Thanks, Nick. That was really interesting. You were talking about some of the small businesses and in terms of they working on their preparedness. I suppose one of the things too is that with that preparedness also comes a great expense. And when you have a lot of small and medium businesses that often can't accommodate those expenses, who takes it on? Does that then fall back on the government to then have to pick up that? Because the government itself often doesn't have the, I guess, their money to implement that either. So I guess, how do we go about that?
Excellent question. I'm really glad you asked that one, because that that allows me to cover another, it wasn't set up just in case, but it really allows me to cover another area that I haven't had a chance to cover. If you look at the work, we saw earlier the work I think that David's doing and David as a team are doing in OSCERT. One of the things is it's quite clear that the sort of preparedness I talk about would not be possible for many SMEs. Again, it just isn't financially viable or possible. So how might we tackle it? Well, certs, and going back to the 1990s, certs have really been able to tackle that by taking information from, as David showed you, taking information from a wide variety of threats, sharing it, and then pumping it out again to give people advice that couldn't be done. In some cases, of course, there are organizations that will take that further and come in and do the assessment we've talked about. In the US, from memory 2003, please correct me if I've got it wrong, the US set up the ISAC, Information Sharing and Advice Center Act. It was a national act. They're still going, and they're very effective. Now, we've got some here, but what that means is what they've done is they've taken the information from a wide range of sources. This is done by sector. So like there's an energy ISAC, and education's ISAC, and various different industries anyway, and they take that. And what they've tried to do, I think, with that and with the complementary changes where they needed it to the privacy laws, is to take away the barrier to sharing the data, because there are some barriers. David talked about some of the barriers, and they're both technical, they're practical, they're legal, and I think they can at least take away some of the legal barriers to sharing. And by doing that, what they've done is very effectively got help, which can be for small enterprises as well as large. But for example, if a large enterprise is being attacked with a particular type of attack, then it can be immediately picked up, anonymized, and passed back to everybody to say, beware for this attack. So I think the expansion of ISACs or certs, or combination of ISACs and certs, is a really good way of doing it. OSCERT does this very well indeed. But it may need to be a lot bigger if it was doing it for the entire SME sector. What I think is it's that combination of stuff that needs to be done. And that means monitoring also the network. So I think that's partly technical, partly process. And it may well be that other organizations can do that, but it also means that organizations like OSCERT, at one point it was doing some monitoring of networks. I don't know whether it is now. I'm not as up to date as I should be, but and some other ISACs are doing some of that work. So there are ISACs forming here, and they're formed and forming, and there was a trusted information sharing network that the federal government did. And this is a means of doing it. But one of the things that came out, and I didn't really have time to cover from that meeting, was some of the times the privacy laws give you a problem in this area. And one of the people out of the 23 at that meeting was the president of the Law Society of Australia, who should know something about the legal aspect of that. And he was looking at how to change the Privacy Act. And one of the things was, how do we share data between each other? That's, the participants. And how do we share it more effectively with government? And I think they were talking more about federal government, state, but all governments, really, it's important. So how do we share it between the governments? How do we share it between the government and the industry sectors that are involved? Because at the moment, I'm not going to put words in people's mouths, but it can be quite hard to share data from governments, particularly with the various security arrangements, classification arrangements. So it can be hard. That's, I think, an area that's coming out of it, and it was coming out, I think, from part of the law review as well, saying we know we need to do this. How do we do it? And those were some of the things we went back as well, saying this is how you're going to do it. There is no point in assuming that Jim's mowing or whatever it is. I'm not taking a particular company. John's mowing, just in case there was a Jim's mowing, but John's mowing is going to be in a position to do this. It isn't. There has to be help from organizations like CERTS and ISAC, but they have to be helped as well to be able to share the data. Sorry, that's a long-winded answer, but I'm really glad you asked that question. Thank you. I silenced you. That's no, I haven't.
So with professional engineers, we see that in order to become an RPQ in Queensland, you'll need to have a 4-year engineering degree or international equivalent. Would you speculate on if I was a student entering today, where I would be best placed in my 3 or 4 years to become a cyber professional of the future in order to set that? So, like, what courses would I do, or could possibly do, in order to achieve that future requirement?
Well, it would depend how you want to be registered, and I mentioned there are a lot of registration and other regulatory arrangements. If one of the issues that you might be registered as an engineer, that would have legal effect in Queensland, but not much else at the moment in terms of cybersecurity. You could well go through, for example, the ACS runs a similar arrangement for registration. It's called Certified Professional. They're different in their approach. The Certified Professional, the ACS runs, links up with a basically a professional, a federal, Australia-wide professions scheme, which is backed by the federal government and all 8 state and territory governments. And what that does is when you're registered as a professional in that one, you limit your liability, for example. So as a personal liability, you can limit it to 2 million, which obviously is much less than would normally be the case. But it requires a particular scheme by a particular association to do it. So you would either go through that route where ACS does that and go through a process of certifying people against the degrees they have and the other qualifications that they bring, part of which can be a wide range of qualifications. Or you could go through an engineering route. In terms of the engineering route, it will depend, I think, on the industry. So there are some industries where almost everything you're doing is pure engineering, but there's a bit of cybersecurity as well, in which case you might find that you are going more appropriately through the Engineers Australia type route. I don't think they're part of this professions one which limits your liability or gets you professional recognition at that stage. I could again be wrong. I'm not an expert on the engineers and stuff, but essentially each of these can get you registration. But the point I made was that you might be a CISSP or you might be one of the others. These are all great qualifications, but at the moment it's very difficult for an employer, I think, to work out which of these things is right. I mean, do you want to have do you want to have one of the qualifications from iCycle, which are very good, or from ISC squared, or from CS, whichever it is. And at the moment, there's no framework which I think allows us to properly say which one we do it. But of course, the simple answer that Ryan will quite rightly give you is you should just take a course through UK side.
Yeah. Okay. So maybe Nick, I think very quick one.
Okay.
So this is related to the 3 components in your 3 keynotes. So basically the ethics, vulnerability, and organization. So what happens, in our education, we take ethics as the first priority. But sometimes I give example like for responsible disclosure. Students ask us, what if the manufacturer does not respond? We don't know how to answer. This happens actually. Vulnerabilities are making to them and they don't have specialized person to handle it. They don't know how to process it. It's actually a very premature ecosystem of framework here. And from your perspective, what kind of suggestion you may give to those industry people?
Well, if you're sorry, I'll do this because I know there are people online, but essentially you're saying if you're reporting, and I'm doing it in summary, if you're reporting vulnerabilities to a vendor or a manufacturer or whatever it is, and they don't respond, what you do? Well, you've got to, I think, do anything like anything else. Do a risk assessment on the product. If you were running something which is highly critical and the vendor doesn't respond, you're probably going to have to try and switch to some other piece of software, because at the end of the day, you need to manage your risk appropriately. I think one of the things, I think that's an issue that I'm highlighting here in terms of the vulnerabilities. People have accepted this position, it's what you've just seen, and look, don't let me put everybody in this, but there are many very responsible vendors. So let's say that everybody is like that. There are many who are very responsive and very responsible. But at the end of the day, what I was saying to you about, think of the car situation. You actually have, I think the government's going to have to find a way of regulating, and this has probably got to be done internationally, hasn't it? Of regulating it and saying, look, I'm sorry, but we actually require you to do that. And I think one of the things we do is push the government, and it probably has to be the federal government, to make it appropriately wide, but to say, this is one of the things that you must be required to do within a certain time frame. And I think if you're pushing them now, they don't do anything. I mean, apart from sending heavies, around to make sure they do. I don't know what else you could do legally. I don't think there's much you can do legally, but I do think this ought to be part of future. We ought to be pushing the government to make this part of the future regulatory requirement. They're looking at a Cyber Security Act, and that could be the sort of thing that we might say, look, you might want to consider putting that in.
Yeah, I agree with you, because the regulation currently is more on the researcher side.
Yes, but less elsewhere. Yeah.
Okay, thanks, Nick. Okay, everyone, so due to the time limitation. Start with the long.
Hello, everyone. Our next session is about IoT and CPS security. So we have 3 talks given by students. And our first talk will be on honeypot for industrial control systems, given by Ms. Wen Zhang. Please go ahead.
Okay. Hello, everyone. My name is Wen Zhang. I'm supervised by Professor Ryan Paul, Associate Professor Gong Bai, and Dr. Nai Dong. And today my topic is about honeypots for industrial control system. So firstly, I'm going to introduce what is industrial control system. So ICS are widely used in many critical areas like chemical processing, water treatment, and transportation to achieve industrial automation. The ICS contains 3 layers. The bottom layer is the physical process layer, which contains the actual actuator and sensors, which send all the physical process values to the control layer, which contains the programmable logical controller. It will program the running of the sensors. And the highest layer is the monitoring and supervisory layer, which contains the human-machine interface and engineering stations to provide a human-readable interface for engineers to control and monitor the whole system. And traditionally, the 3 layers, they are physically connected with each other and within a closed network. So there is no external threat need to be considered. But with the development of internet is introduced to the system, and this allows engineers to achieve remote monitor and control of ICS. However, it's also provide attackers a chance to get into the ICS network and conduct attacks. And there are some already attacks happened in the last few decades. In year 2000 in Queensland, the a pre-employee of Marushido companies, released about 264K gallons of sewage into local waterways. And 10 years later, the Stuxnet worm stealthily increased the spinning speed of the centrifuges of Iran's nuclear station, which destroys their centrifuges and degrades their physical machines. And in year 2015, about 30 substations of Ukraine's electricity company substations, they were maliciously shut down, which caused the power off for 6 hours, which affects about 200,000 people. And the cyber attacks are still happening every day. So we need to find a way to protect the ICS system. My research is focusing on the ICS deception technology, honeypot, which is a mechanism that simulates the behavior of real devices. And once you convince attackers to believe your honeypot is a real device, they will attack your honeypot. And in the meantime, you are able to collect their attack strategies and use this data to better protect the ICS system. And the honeypot can be separated into different categories based on the purpose of honeypot. For example, based on the objectives, it can be separated into research and production honeypots. And there are also server-based, client-based, and physical and virtual honeypots. But the main classification focused on by current research is based on the honeypot interaction, and is separate honeypot into high interaction and low interaction honeypot. So for ICS honeypot, the aim is to convince attackers to believe the honeypot is a real device, and we leave the real device safe. And also in the meantime, we collect attackers' information and use this data to protect the current system. And the main simulated targets for ICS is the programmable logical controllers, as is the main component to control the whole system. And for the ICS low interaction honeypots, it provides limited services like the initial connection with attackers able to build initial connection with the honeypot. The pros is easy and cheap to design and implement, and is able to deceive inexperienced attackers. But for high-level network reconnaissance tools and experienced attackers, this is not enough. The early stage low interaction honeypots, they mainly focus on the correctness of the response values. So they will respond the correct but fixed configuration and protocol responses to attackers. So this is, of course, not enough, as if you deploy 100 honeypots and they all respond the same value, it's easily identified by attackers. So gas pot and shape honeypots, they try to fix this problem by adding some random noise to the honeypot response values. But the low interaction honeypot, it can't support deep interaction with attackers. That's why the high interaction honeypot for ICS is introduced. It supports deeper interaction with attackers by supporting more protocol services and physical system simulation, and is able to deceive the reconnaissance tools and experienced attackers. The problem is they're generally expensive and time-consuming to design and implement. The existing high interaction honeypots, some of them focus on the protocol service simulation, so without the physical system simulation. The problem is the lack of physical system simulation can be suspected by knowledgeable attackers. Like if they try to read the LED light state and the honeypot not able to respond, attackers will easy to see the nature of the honeypot. So the mini CPS try to solve this problem by reading the value from external API files. The problem for this approach is the physical process values are generated based on the math and physical laws. But in real world case, there are some environmental factors like the weather and the location. They will cause some error range as well, but this is not included. And the Honeybee tried to prove that it's possible to simulate the physical process of real devices. But this is just zero work, and there is no further research for this. So after the literature review, I summarized 3 key factors a ICS honeypot needs to simulate. Firstly is the system configuration variables. For example, the PLC model name, the MAC address, the serial number. These values need to be customized for every deployed honeypot to make sure the information is correct. And then for the protocol service simulation, we need to consider the coverage of necessary protocols. For example, the Modbus PLC support HTTP and not Modbus PLC. The Schneider PLC support Modbus and HTTP. Then the honeypot simulates the Schneider PLC need to support both protocols. And also for the function code coverage, the more function code you cover, the more realistic the honeypot is. And then for the physical process simulation, of course, it's better to cover all the physical process variables as a real device. And also the correctness of variable values need to be guaranteed. And by applying these rules, I simulate the Rockwell PLC in our UQ Industry 4.0 energy test lab. We have a Rockwell and a Schneider PLC in our lab, which support at the left right hand side the HMI. That's the HMI of the digital twin physical process, which is a belt system powered by the window farm at the bottom. And as you can see in the HMI, there are many physical process variables like the 3000 turbine speed, the position of the barrel. These values are all changing during the physical system running. And the honeypot I designed is called HoneyHive, which is a Annie-Brantley focused high interaction honeypot that simulates realistic physical process. And the challenge to simulate a honeypot, is firstly, we try to reach the value between HMI and PLC. So you need to find a way to gain the communication packets between them. And also for most industrial protocols, there are some Windows specific function codes which are not publicly documented. And also there is no standard to evaluate the honeypot. So to solve this problem, there are 4 steps. Firstly, is to interrupt the communication between HMI and PLC using man-in-the-middle attack to grab the physical process values. And also, but only doing this is not enough. Because the HMI not contains all the process variables. Some PLC configuration variables like the PLC time, these are not displayed on the HMI. So additional probe script need to be designed to fuzzing all the possible physical process variables and function codes. And once these values are collected, the next step is to read the payload of these packets and recognize which progress variable belongs to which value, and then use some algorithm to analyze the changing rules of these progress variables and simulate in HoneyHive. And the last step is to evaluate the honeypot by comparing the probe results with the real device and then improve the honeypot. And the contribution by doing the first 3 steps, it can generate a framework to simulate different ICS PLCs. So you give a brand new PLC, follow the exact same work, we're able to support different PLC models. And for the evaluation, we're able to provide the evaluation criteria for ICS honeypot and also generate the HoneyHive PLC. And that's the protocol services HoneyHive support. Because it's an Annie-Brantley focused PLC, it supports the HTTP, IP, and CIP protocols that are generally used by Annie-Brantley PLCs. And also for initial connection, after communicating with the real PLC, we find the handshake and connection rules by randomly generate the session handle and connection ID to build the initial connection. And for the read, write, and list identity functions, we're able to cover 90% of the function codes compared with the real device, and also 98% error code. The error code is like if the attacker tries to read the physical objects not supported by the real PLC, then the real PLC will respond with the error code like object not available. Then these error codes need to be supported as well. And for the physical system simulation, Honeyhive able to cover 11 fixed system setting parameters and also 8 dynamic parameters. The dynamic one is like the barrel position and the bell speed. And during the Honeyhive simulation process, it also considers the error range caused by real-world factors. And it also summarized some system specific rules, like for our digital twin system, if you try to switch the system off, the turbine speed will keep on decreasing until it drops to 0. Even you try to start the system again, it will still drop to 0 and then start to increase. These are some special rules programmed in the PLC, and they are supported in Honeyhive. And this is the result for the physical process simulation. The top one is for the turbine speed, which is increased from 0 to 3000. The blue line is the real PLC value change, and the orange line is the Honeyhive value. As you can see, they overlap each other, so it's follow exactly like the real device. And for the second, the bottom one is for the barrel position. The barrel is moving on the belt. And this variable is affected by external factors like the friction of the belt or other factors. So the blue one calls the error range. So it's not exact value for each round. And then Honeyhive try to simulate the error range still within the real device range, but follow the same chain. And also for some dependent variables like the ejectors, it will change the state. It will pop up at the point of the decreasing angle there. So the dependent variables are included as well. And to evaluate the Honeyhive, I use the meta attack ICS framework. So I pick some technologies that can test the honeypot. And firstly, for the discovery step, is use Nmap to check the open ports protocols and fingerprints. And the results able to show the fingerprints are indistinguishable compared with the real device. And the further step, they basically read and write the values of the honeypot and real device. And during this process is proves that Honeyhive able to support the read, write, and basic protocol services as real device. And also for the physical process, it's already evaluated here. So the values are all within range. And that's my current research. Thanks for listening.
We'll have time for questions.
Yes, thanks for that presentation. That's really fascinating. I'm really excited about this because it's an area that I think a lot of people in cybersecurity are really looking towards. Question is, how quickly will your honeypot be actually seeing real-world attacks that you can then catalog, characterize, share with others, that sort of stuff? How quickly do you think that can come to market?
It's currently deployed on AWS to try to collect data, and it's deployed for 6 months. It's not added to the slides because time limit, and the data is already there. I'm currently trying to build a database to analyze the data.
Any other questions? I just have quick questions for you, for me. So when you do the simulation, right? So you need to collect the data to do the simulation, and you do. I see that you mentioned buzzing and this kind of testing stuff to collect the data or input values. How do you make sure those values important or representative, for simulation?
The value
Representative of the real device values.
I collect for each. So the process is try to modify each writable variable, and I collect 50 samples for each. So there's not a single sample, collect 50 samples and then calculate their maximum and minimum value and the mean value, and then use some math formulas to generate. So
Okay. So do you consider that special cases, those devices may be operated in real situations? Or just consider the normal regular use of those devices? When you consider, when you use the devices, right, to run those devices, what the values, do you consider just the regular normal usage of the devices or some exceptional uses of those devices?
Currently it's for the normal usage.
Okay. All right.
Thank
Thank you.
you.
Let's thank the speaker again. So our second talk will be on security modeling and analysis for in-vehicle networks. And this will be given by Ms. Hong Yong Lee. And Hong Yong actually is a second year PhD student at UC.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Nyong, second year PhD student under the supervisor of Professor Dan Kim and Wang Dong. Today, I would like to talk about security modeling and analysis for in-vehicle network. This is the generic in-vehicle network architecture. In the past, attacker needs physical access to the car via the onboard diagnostic to inject or manipulate car messages to control the car. However, nowadays, when the car becomes more connected, attacker can remote attack the car through the infotainment system. Furthermore, the term software-defined vehicle is now a revolution in the automotive industry, and we enable the over-the-air updating and new features such as controlling car function using touchscreen or automatic driving car. They make the car more become like a computer on wheel and more vulnerable to the cyber attack. And the cyber attack to the vehicle is may cause a very serious impact, like life-threatening or traffic congestion. But most of the software vulnerability found in the car mostly found after the car has been released. So our is try to identify the way to do the security modeling of the in-vehicle network at the early stage of the system development. And recently, we have collaborated to work on the model called hierarchical model-based cybersecurity risk assessment during system design that was accepted on the IFIPSAP 2023 conference. This model is the introduced way for assessing cybersecurity risk at the early stage of the system development. We also provide a way to model the in-vehicle network architecture using OMG UML and automatically transform it into attack graph. We also use various quantitative metrics to construct a three-state and score builder so that the security decision maker can know how severe the security of the system is. This is our proposed approach. The model includes four phases. The first phase is using UML to model the system information. The second phase is when all the UML from system model can turn into connection graph information, and all the components which include vulnerabilities can be in the attack surface. And in phase 3 is the graph solver, is where we can calculate the three-state and determine all the possible attack paths. And the last phase is when we apply some security metrics to calculate the security of the system. This the detail for the first phase. The first phase is graphical system modeling and model transformation. In order to model the invoker network using UML and transform it into the attack graph, we have to define the very precise way to model the security component. For example, we define that to model the function, we need to use the UML part attribute, and for the port in the part is using UML connector attribute. And we also have developed a way to model the hierarchical level with from the early system design. They can model the layer, the full layer 0. And then when we have more component, we model the layer 1. And when with the function of the component, we model layer 2. And all the information like vulnerabilities and access score is given by using the stereotype. On phase 2, we developed the model analyzers with a plugin for MDE for CPP. MDE for CPP is a framework that using to transfer the UML model to the executable C++. And the input of this phase is the UML models based system model, and the result is the graph of the system that includes all the nodes and all the connection between the component of the invoker network. In the phase 3, all of the output from phase 2 is turned into phase 3 that we calculate the 3 space, which is the first node and the end node of the part, and do the path traversal to find all the attack part from the attacker to the access. In phase 3, we calculate score on both attack part and network level. Here we have some security metric. For the attack part level, we have access value with the impact of the access of the in-vehicle. And the risk and vulnerabilities is the score that we took from the CVSS base score. And for the network level, we have some metric, 4 metric. The first metric is number of attack paths, and the shortest attack path, the mean of attack path length with the average effort that the attacker may have to apply to be able to reach the target. And the standard deviation of attack path length is for understanding if the mean of attack path length is representative or not. Okay. Now for validate the model, we create a case study with a security assessment of BMW E3. The network model we took from the research from the King Security Lab and the BMW official network architecture. Here you can see we mostly model the information system of the car with the attacker from outside can access the car through 2 ways, the physical access and the remote access. With the physical access, the attacker using a USB stick to get into the head unit of the car. And with the physical access, the attacker using fake base station to force the car to connect to the network. Okay. This the system model. And next we have the attacker model. Again, attacker model can goal is to gain control over important car components such as a door control, airbag control, or car activation or deactivation. We have 2 scenarios. That's physical access that when attacker have input the USB through the head unit and exploit vulnerability in the diagnostic or navigation service. And after get root of the informative system, the attacker can send CAN message or UDS message to control different car function. And the second scenario is the remote access, when the attacker setting up a fake base station to force the car to connect to it. and then exploiting vulnerability in the browser or in the over-the-air update to gain root privilege of the head unit or telematic unit, and from there they can send diagnostic messages to control other ECU inside the car. We also provide two defense models. The first one is a patching management, like patching all known or all possible vulnerability. It's like patching vulnerability inside the car. However, patching all of the known vulnerability and possible vulnerability is unrelated because of the cost and time constraints. So we are making an assumption here that we only focus on patching the vulnerability which have the highest CVSS base score. And the second defense model is apply IDS. Because the limited computational performance in vehicle component, because inside a vehicle, the computer needs to be endure the high temperature and high vibration, so that the computer in the vehicle cannot be too strong. So we make an assumption that the IDPS only have deployed in the central gateway to detect all the CAN or UDS messages from the informatic system to the another function of the car. We introduced 5 CVEs, is a real CVE on the BMW E3 inside the model. All the vulnerability is defined on the UML stereotype of all the components that included. Applying to the proposed model, the first phase, we model the system model, the architecture of the car into UML. We have a 3-layer. The first layer is the environment layer, which can be modeled as a very early in the system design. We include only the attacker and the system and what way that the attacker can control the system. And the second layer, we move to some ECU, some main ECU of the car, like the head unit, telematic units, and central gateway. And at this layer 3, we introduce more function and include the service and function and software that inside the component, as well as the OS version and vulnerability on it. Well, from the UML model, we can now generate the system graph. The system graph include all the components inside the system, and from the system graph, we calculate the 3 space that all the node with vulnerabilities and generate all the attack path from the attacker to the inside system of the car. For the next phase, like security metric calculation, we create 3 scenarios. That the first scenario is the system with vulnerabilities SAC. The second scenario is system with defense model like patching, and the third scenario is the system defense model with IDPS. After using the security metric, we can calculate, we can compare the scenario 1, 2, and 3, and all the value for this. Here we can see that we apply the scenario 2 with the system with defense model patching. The security, the whole system security metric is reduced a lot. So patching the most, the vulnerability which have the highest CVSS score is more effective than putting the IDS on the central gateway. However, this is the security decision maker can choose which type of vulnerability they want, they can update, or where to put the IDS, and use that model to rerun again to define which way is the best effective defense methods that can apply to the in-vehicle. And this is the short description for this model, that the model is successfully represent the in-vehicle network architecture. It can automatically analyze security attributes and calculate security metric. Our case study only use 3 hierarchical layers to present different stage of the development process. However, it just simplified approach and may not fully capture the complexity of the real-world industry development process. And the proposed approach not yet consider the modeling of the dynamic evolution of the system security stage. And one more weakness of the model is that the model only consider the car as a static target. However, the car is a moving target. So these are future work. This is everything. Thank you so much.
Any questions? That's brilliant. I love seeing that. It's a great end state that I'd like to aspire to one day, and it would make speaking with my stakeholders a lot easier and say, here's the big number, put the funding there first. So I think it's really useful. Question for me, with the CVEs, how are you identifying which components were susceptible to which CVEs? Is there a big process to that, or are you just saying, hey, look, this component is this version of something, and we know it's there?
Yeah. During the system design, it's be possible to scan the software product proactive scan before it can be released. And in my knowledge, when I learned about the vehicle architecture and vehicle attack, I learned that many vehicles, for example, the infotainment system mostly use a very common OS. For example, like Linux or QNX of BlackBerry or maybe Android. And these mostly use a very old version. Yeah, the beginning version, so that it may have a lot of vulnerability on that. And most of the vulnerability that we use here is, yeah. So,
Yeah, fantastic. I really didn't follow that. Thank you.
thank you.
Any other questions? I have a question about the vulnerability you analyzed, because you mentioned that too many vulnerabilities you analyze. So you focus on the score is high, right? High score vulnerabilities. So can you give us an idea like how many high, how many kind of a rough picture of the percentage or the scale of those vulnerabilities for in-vehicle errors?
Can you clarify the question?
Yeah, so basically I'm wondering, like, you evaluate, you do the case study, how many are categorized as high according to the score evaluation?
Yeah. Now, currently in my analysis, I only choose the vulnerability which have the highest CVRS score.
Yeah.
But in real life, not all of the high CVRS score can be patched. It's just a case study and example. However, if the manufacturer that using that model, they can choose which vulnerability that they can patch. And see how it changes and how the attack part be shortened or be longer, or it or maybe the attack part can be disappear from the analysis.
Yeah, thanks. Sounds good. Thank you.
Thank you.
Any other questions? If not, let's thank our speaker again for presentation. Our last talk in this section is on intelligent cyber attacks for moving target defense techniques in software-defined network.
Hi, so can you hear me? Hello, you can hear me?
Yes, we can hear.
Yes, okay, good. And also, can you see my screen there in person?
Yes.
Great. Okay, so I'll get started.
Yes, Tina, please.
Okay, great, thank you. So first I want to apologize for not being there in person. My flight back to Brisbane was canceled, so we have to do it this way. So I'll hope you'll bear with me for the presentation. Sorry about that. So yeah, my topic is, as you mentioned there, in intelligent cyber attacks for moving target defenses. So I'll get started now. So first, a bit of background on the moving target defenses. The idea here is that there's no such thing as perfect security in a system. So one way to protect the system is to constantly shift something in the attack surface and make it harder for the attacker. This way, despite the fact that the system might have some vulnerabilities, we've raised the requirement for the attacker to be able to exploit it. They'll lose the information they have, and they'll have to use more resources to complete an attack. In particular, in this case, we're using a virtual IP shuffling MTD, which I'll go through later. But the problem is that in the design and evaluations of these types of MTD, previous work has usually assumed that the attacker is pretty simple and static. So they've shown MTD to be effective at reducing the success of those types of attackers. But as the MTD gets adopted more widely, and at the same time as automating attacks is becoming more common and more accessible, as in we're starting to see some AI-based cyber attacks in other fields, then the evaluation of our MTD against those kinds of naive, simple, non-adaptive attackers isn't enough to show that they're protecting our system. So we need to be able to protect our networks against those automated intelligent attacks, and we need to be able to show that our defenses are protecting us against those attacks. And the goal of this project is to address that in the software-defined networking environment. So looking at the previous work, as I mentioned before, the attacks in the evaluations of MTD are rarely intelligent. We get those kinds of simple, naive attacks that you might see on the internet. And these are most of the attacks that you would see, but they are pretty simple to overcome. And so the goal of this work is to investigate the possible intelligent attacks that you could have on your MTD so that later you can harden the MTD against those attacks. So we do that first by developing a taxonomy of possible intelligent attacks against the MTD technique, and then showing that our framework can be used to generate some data sets for creating the intelligent attacks and using that to evaluate and enhance the MTD later on. Here we experiment to demonstrate the feasibility of some machine learning powered attacks on our MTD, and we hope to harden the defenses against those attacks in the future. So we've identified places where we can add intelligence to our attacks and created a categorization which will guide the development of the attacks. And I've listed the categories here. There's two possible types. In the first case, we are doing some analysis on data to determine the MTD properties. So here the attacker tries to find out when the MTD is being triggered, what the MTD is defending, and how the MTD will change the system. And in the second part, the attacker tries to use that information to make decisions. So the attacker tries to decide when to launch the attacks to maximize the effectiveness of the attacks, what attacks to launch based on the system properties, and how to target the system specifically. So maybe which host to target first or what order, things like that. And these mirror the what, and when, what, and how of the MTD defense mechanism. So I've listed here some examples for each category. And the one that we're looking at in the first work, so the first goal is when the MTD has been triggered. But for each one, I've listed some examples here. So you could, for example, try and work out what events will trigger the MTD, predict the next host address when the IP address of the host is being changed. And on the other side, decide when to launch attacks and which attacks to launch given how much time you have left, things like that. So the very first attacker goal, as I mentioned, is to determine when the MTD has been triggered. And this is for a time-based virtual IP shuffling MTD. Here we're changing the IP address of our host. So if an attacker has been scanning our network and has chosen some hosts that they've fingerprinted for attack, then once the IP addresses are shuffled, they lose all the information that they had and they have to scan through the network again and try to find their target from the start. So with having this information, so if the attacker is able to determine when the MTD has been triggered, then the attacker could time their attacks to start immediately after the MTD interval and maximize the attack window that they have and thereby maximize their chances of success. And to do this, we've got an analysis pipeline, which I've included at the bottom of the page there. So we do the data collection and cleaning of the data, and then we do some clustering to try and determine after each packet, has the MTD been triggered or not? So for that first part of the pipeline, it's the setting of the environment and the collection of the data. And this is the...
Oh, hi, mate. Sorry, I'm just slow to get back to you. I can talk now anyway.
Yeah, right, no problem.
Okay, am I good to keep going? Yep, okay. Let me, right. So this is the small scale MT testbed. I think you would have seen it in your tour at UQ today. And the plan is to first develop and test our goals in a larger simulation and then verify them using that testbed. So to start with, first we have this mininet simulation, which is based on the testbed that I think you've seen today. And then we'll move on to a larger simulation and then also testing on the physical testbed. So as I mentioned, in this particular case, we're using the virtual IP shuffling MTD. And here is our network. It's protected by the controller, which is running the MTD. And you can see the parts that are in the SDN controller's control in orange. We have an attacker that's directly connected to the outermost switch in our network, and it's sniffing the network traffic, and it can also scan hosts from there. Our client is connected to the web server inside the network, and it's making legitimate connections throughout the time. And the data that we've collected is the sniffed packets from the attacker, and also the ground truth times for the MTD triggering. And we only use the ground truth times to measure how well our clustering worked. So the data that the attacker is working with is just the sniff packets that they've got from that first switch. Once we've collected the data, we do the analysis and clustering. So the data includes all the traffic flows across the network for that duration of time. And as you can imagine, there are far more flows that are not related to the MTD triggering than those that are related to the MTD triggering. So first, we address that imbalance by undersampling the majority class. And then we do our feature extraction mainly using CIC flow meter, which identifies the flows and then extracts about 84 features. These include things like the duration of the flow, the number of packets in each direction, which flags were set for each flow, things like that. And using the extracted features from CIC flow meter, first we filter out the irrelevant features, so things that don't change maybe across our entire traffic or appear to be random across all our traffic. And then we add some new features, and those ones are the time between the flows and also the entropy of the addresses over time. So these are things that we think would be relevant to our environment specifically, where we're changing the IP addresses. And then with that data, we do dimensionality reduction and clustering to try and work out, has the MTD triggered or not. We assume that the attacker can't access the ground truth for the MTD trigger time because we're taking an attacker that's completely outside our network. And so we have to use unsupervised learning. And we try both centroid and density-based methods for the clustering to have a range of methods. So you can see the pipeline there, and I'll go through the results now. If this will go to the next page, there we go. So I'll remind you again, our goal was to determine when the MT has been triggered, and we achieved the best results for doing that using optics and an autoencoder for pre-processing and then optics for the clustering. And we achieve an adjusted random score of 0.83. So we use the adjusted random score because we don't have labels. So it's 0.82 for the adjusted random score. And we expect that the reason the autoencoder and optics work well, but the other methods don't work so well, is that we think our clusters don't have nice linear boundaries and have different densities. So it's harder for the other methods to cluster them, especially because we have so many features. One thing about this result is that to be detectable, there has to be relevant traffic in the network at the time of the MTD triggering. So if the MTD triggers, but there's no traffic to the server at that time, then there's nothing for us to look at and see that the MTD was triggered. There's no symptoms in our packets. And this was the case for enough triggers in our data set to give a theoretical maximum ASR of around 0.86. So that's the result that we would be aiming for. And we think that the theoretical and actual ASR can be increased by just increasing the amount of network traffic so that we have those kinds of relevant traffic more often. That makes sense. Yep, so the key takeaways from this work is that it's possible to determine the MTD properties using machine learning by observing and creating traffic in network as an attacker. And with the framework, we can study the susceptibility of MTD against these types of attacks, and hopefully in the future harden the defenses against the more intelligent attacks. So the future work for us is first using the small-scale physical testbed to do our experiments to capture the more realistic network conditions that you might get, especially in the timings and things like that. And also do a larger simulation, maybe an enterprise size simulation, to capture any effects that you might have from having a much larger network. And evaluate the MTD against other types of attacks that we introduced in the categorization at the start. So this was just the first goal, but there were other goals that we target. And this concludes my presentation. Thank you for your time. I'll ask any questions that you have now.
Questions? No questions? Tina actually was co-advised by me, so I don't have any question for her.
Hi, Tina. That's a really nice presentation. I got a quick question about the clustering algorithms you use. Like, other than like k-means and optics, have you looked at any other clustering algorithms, and does that like have any like impact on the detections?
Yep. So I did look at other ones. I looked at, I looked at k-means, I looked at dbScan, I looked at optics, and I looked at two others that I can't remember right now, and they do have an effect. So I found that if we do density-based clustering, it's possible to get a good result. But with something like k-means, where it's looking at the distance, it's not possible to get a good result. And that's why I think the boundary isn't nicely linear. So it's possible to do with optics, which is kind of agnostic to the densities, and can have nonlinear boundaries, but it's not possible to do with k-means. I included those two to demonstrate, because we have k-means that's used very commonly in the kinds of network traffic analysis, and it usually works pretty well. And optics was the one that performed best. So I included those two ends as the comparison. Does that answer the question?
Other questions? All right, so let's thank Tina again for the presentation.
Thank you.
This is it for this session, and our next session will be UQ seed funding session chaired by.
Yeah, let's have a 5 minutes break and then come back here. Is that okay, everyone? Yeah, we need some break. After 5 minutes break. So I didn't know that.
actually had a pot of funding that we issue out to projects that are submitted. They are maximum about 75K, but if it seats something, get a bit of research assistance, support, or a little bit of equipment and that kind of thing. So the next few talks are actually going to be, you're going to see basically an interdisciplinary problem and a team of different people from different schools coming together. There are at least 2 different schools in each project. So this is the context of the presentation. So I hope you enjoy this, because this is where I believe that's where the magic of cybersecurity comes out. Okay, so yeah.
Yeah, thank you, Ryan. Yeah, thank you for introducing the background of UQ Cyber Seed funding. So we have 4 talks in this session. So don't leave the room until all speakers finish their talks. And we have a nice gathering, right? The social gathering in 313A. So Tiani ordered a lot of food and beverage. So please stay until the end of the session and then enjoy the rest of the social gathering. Okay, our networking opportunity. Don't miss the networking opportunity. Okay. Let me introduce the first speaker, Dr. Moya Kate Baldry. Yeah, she's with EECS now. Yeah, please join me in welcoming her. Yeah, thank you.
Hello, everybody. So now to the fun stuff. So I'm working on an interdisciplinary extended reality cybersecurity project. So you cannot probably get more cutting edge. So thank you very much to the Cybersecurity Seed Funding for letting us do this, I think, really interesting work. It is an international interdisciplinary team. So I've been working here with Dr. Mashuda Glencross on this project, but we do have some internationals who are experts in XR and also in cybersecurity helping us with this as well. So now it's not moving. So I don't want to make any assumptions. By extended reality technologies, we're talking about virtual reality, mixed reality, augmented reality. So we have been particularly focused on social mixed reality gaming environments. So there's very social multi-user platforms. We're not just restricted to mixed reality headsets though. So we're looking at the mixed reality continuum. So when you put on a virtual reality headset, while they may say to you, you're being transported to another reality and have all these wonderful marketing phrases for you, your data is still being extracted at millions up to billions of data points per session. So please, if someone tells you, wow, virtual reality is taking you to a new reality, you have my permission to say no. It's just marketing and we won't be fooled. So has anyone tried virtual reality? Yeah, so most people are kind of familiar with the technology. Fantastic. So we're looking at the continuum really of technologies from augmented reality filters right through to the latest virtual reality devices. So it's quite extensive, but we're particularly focused on those social gaming platforms in those technologies, which are potentially millions of users now, and in the future will be billions of users. So we're not just looking at the risks now, we're looking at the future risks as well. So what we kind of need to know about these technologies is that there's this massive shift in that we're moving from representational media, so an avatar on a screen, to embodied interactions. So when you're in a virtual reality or even a mixed reality headset, those cameras and sensors are picking up your movements in the 6 degrees of freedom and movement. So you move your arm, it's an embodied action that's reflected, it's picked up by the sensors, etc., and reflected in the environment. Okay, so we've moved from representational media to embodied media. We're looking at also the biggest thing we need to know about these environments is that it's collecting more data on us, right, through all of those sensors, etc. So we're talking about expanded attack surfaces. So not only are there kind of novel experiences, but also the expanded attack surfaces. So we've had to sort of look at both of these complexities in this environment. So the aims really of the research project, and it's been going for about 2 years now, is to explore that breadth and scope of attacks in these platforms and to co-design some visual interventions and reporting mechanisms. And toward the end of the project, and I've been pushing for this, is to look at AI attacks at scale on these platforms. So as I just said, we've been going for about 2 years now. This is basically the timeline, and we're preparing all of our research or publications at the moment. So as I said, we've moved into these embodied digital and now generative environments, particularly as AI combines with these technologies. So we know that these technologies can heighten the psychological impact. So again, just because we're in a virtual platform doesn't mean that the attacks will not have real impact. And in some cases, they can even have heightened psychological impact. I don't want to get into the depths of some of these attacks. They can be quite disturbing. And I guess I should give a trigger warning as well before we go any further. But, you know, we're talking about some quite horrific things from, you know, child grooming by hyper-realistic, as the technology improves, hyper-realistic attacks, right? So, and as I discussed before, we're talking about expanded attack surfaces. So not only do we need cybersecurity interventions, but there's also a market opportunity in terms of acts coming through like the UK Online Reform Bill, where platforms will be fined 10% of global revenues if they don't stop these attacks from happening. So we had multiple questions as we went into this project. Not only do we want to understand our the viability of harms and attacks, but we wanted to understand community perceptions of these harms. We wanted to know the scope of harms. We wanted to understand how these technologies expand harms. We wanted to understand how we can collect empirical data on harms, because most of the information that we have at the moment is anecdotal. So while the UK Online Reform Bill is basically transferring governance of these attacks to the platform itself. And as we've seen through Cambridge Analytica and other situations, potentially with these platforms can't be held responsible and accountable at the same time. So finally, we wanted to ask what recommendations can we make to industry and to regulators and users. So obviously we've been applying a human-centered lens to cybersecurity approaches. And while many cybersecurity approaches look at the adversary attack model, we've been using a cyber harm model. So we're looking at the physical, cultural, reputational, psychological and emotional harms. And we've been using co-design and speculative fiction to engage in participatory design. And this is what's helped us gather some of these community insights, but also it's informed our visual intervention systems. We've been able to expand on that breadth of harms through speculative fiction so that people can really understand their harms and take it out of cybersecurity language and into a really accessible format. And then obviously we'll be testing the interventions. So, sorry to race through all this so quickly. We ran some co-design workshops. We ran one in particular with academia, and in that we were really looking into realities of attacks. So this almost this spread of attacks from within these platforms and how they could be distributed to other platforms, etc. So that extraction of data. And then we ran another workshop that was with industry to really start defining the breadth of harms and attacks in these environments. So I do have ethics approval. So while we're here, does anybody have any ideas, suggestions about attacks that might be happening or could happen in these extended reality platforms? Anything like been sitting at the back of your brain, you've been like dying to tell somebody? Yeah. Yeah. So putting potentially millions of people together, and it's not just via a screen anymore. It's not via text message, a like button, a comment, a photo, a video. It's from having a physical interaction with somebody via these technologies and how they could hurt you. And I'll show you this, in real life, bullying is kind of restricted to somebody coming up to you and bullying you. Then social media came along, and it's about hearing that somebody's, potentially bullying you or has spread information about you online. In these environments being potentially generative environments of fully computer generated environments, or environments that are augmented through digital overlays, etc. The potential for generative AI or scaled AI attacks is looming. And that's where we really need to be focused as well. How can these attacks be harmful? How can they be harmful at scale? So we'll move on. We developed just some word maps in relation to these co-design workshops. So we could really see that people were terrified about how our data was going to be used. So not only are we concerned about the extraction of that data and its misuse, but how are platforms that seem to have verified use of this data, how are they using them as well? We don't, for example, know how Meta and those other platforms, Google, etc., are using the data that they're gathering through these technologies and what they're doing with it. There's really not much transparency there at all. So you can see just from these data maps, these word maps, just how diverse this space is. So then we just developed some affinity diagrams of the extended reality threats as well. Lots of topics around it's the Wild West still. No regulation, not enough regulation. People were particularly concerned about exploitation of children, impersonating identities, etc., identity attacks, but also data privacy, data sovereignty, and the use of bots in this space. So if you are concerned about the way that news, etc., is delivered now via Fox Media, for example, what happens when you're in a generative AI environment and all of the people you seem to be interacting with seem like they're human, but they're actually bots? Are they reflecting the values and attitudes that these platforms have been capturing from people as they interact? Or are these people, the bots that they're interacting with, generated by another platform for the purpose of manipulation? So then we decided to use some speculative fiction to draw out some of these attacks. I'm just going to highlight a few key attacks that we're talking about, and particularly talk about sort of the potential AI scaled attacks. So interestingly, and this shows where some of the AI models are at the moment. And I had to be careful because I didn't want to get kicked off Discord when I put in some of our scenarios. So I just wanted to use some basic ChatGPT, etc., image generation models that were out there. So when I put this in, I wanted it to show me what it would look like if a hacker stole my data from an offshore cloud facility. Just for the purposes of giving you a visual idea of some of these attack scenarios, this is what it gave me. It literally translated my attack to be a personal environment with an offshore. You can see that there's a shore outside the window with a cloud ominously creeping into my bedroom to steal my data. But that's just, a free accessible AI generator that doesn't talk about the sophistication of some of the, the AI models that are out there. But I thought it was interesting. So we also know not only can it get, access our data, they can turn on cameras even though the cameras are turned off. They can take infrared images of your bedroom, of your environment. So not only are we talking about the capacity of these technologies to capture your data, they're capturing the data of your house, your environment, which is, way more than just a webcam on our screen can do. Can also capture data of bystanders. People have never agreed to participate in this data or with these technologies at all. So then I was starting to look at mega events. We've got the Olympics coming, etc. as well, and there's talk of an immersive Olympics. So what happens if you get a scaled right-wing attack on an immersive Olympics? So we've talked about a few different scenarios in this space. For example, it's possible for you to be in the crowd of an immersive event and turn around to see multiple people, hundreds of avatars simulating sex in that environment. What happens if the people in that crowd are children? how do you manage scaled attacks for immersive crowds at mega events? This is going to be one of our key challenges. What if somebody, because they want an open metaverse, what if they take guns from another platform into a rap concert, an immersive rap concert? What if you turn around and you see people, and I'm sorry for this trigger warning, being virtually lynched? We don't have standards at the moment that can stop it. So I couldn't get Nazi through the filters, but I could get Hitler standing in front of a Brisbane Olympics stadium for 2000. They've got 22, but I put 2032 into the image. It gets scarier. I'll come back to why. So some of the other scenarios we're looking at are just things like navigation interventions, particularly for AR and MR. Not only could fake geo towers hack into your headset to collect commercial IP, but we can also intervene in people's navigation in environments and send them toward protests or send them toward dangerous places, etc. And we've also looked at the authenticity of some of these environments. How do you know they're real? If you're conducting an interview for a job, or at the bank for a loan, or contract tracing, or a hospital, a medical appointment, how do you know that you're in an authentic environment? You'll probably know it's not authentic when your insurance goes up next week. And we talked a little bit about mega events, etc., but particularly interested in sexual exploitation, but also the proliferation of hate crimes that can occur through these platforms. Moving on, I asked ChatGPT to give me code for a terrorist attack at a Brisbane Olympics, and it gave me some code. So we've moved from these types of attacks requiring technical knowledge to these types of attacks not requiring any technical knowledge at all. And I asked it, and I've been asking it for months, to give me ideas about how to construct social engineering attacks in virtual reality. And it will tell me. So one thing I'd like to do is set up a study to get people with no technical experience to run these attacks. Okay, but only against NPCs. It won't be against real people. And just see how far we can take the technology, but yeah. The other thing we've been doing is testing some of these reporting mechanisms. So sort of will giving people reporting mechanisms in these environments make them feel safer. But obviously we can tell already that we're going to require AI interventions, we're going to require standards, we're going to require regulations and reporting mechanisms. Particularly, I've been interested in looking at the design of embodied reporting mechanisms, because we're in an embodied environment. To not break immersion in these environments, can we somehow design the reporting mechanisms so that people will use them, so that they will be more efficient? So we've been just looking at different methods of working with embodied reporting mechanisms. We do find that women use reporting mechanisms a little bit differently to men. So in one study in particular, we looked at a watch design so that people could just have a reporting mechanism interface that they could interact with via the watch. And that seemed to be a lot more popular than touching a reporting button, for example, and then having to go through an interface that way. But we did a little Python game for the younger audience as well. We're only at user testing stage with that. Early data is showing us that they will not use any reporting mechanisms. So that's terrifying. Potentially, they may be more interested in the embodied reporting mechanisms. Okay, yes, so that's just a little bit of the data. So the future work, we're at the point where we run out of money. We are looking for more money. We're waiting on an e-safety commissioner grant and looking around for some other funding at the moment so that we can continue with this, what I think is quite important research. Future of human interaction, we need to start designing the interventions, and we need to understand the scope of these attacks now, not only so we can work locally, but so we can work internationally, because as we know, these attacks are going to come from anywhere. So I hope I haven't scared you. I hope I haven't put you off any of these technologies. As we know, it's not the technology's fault. It's always going to be the human behavior. that is at the bottom of all of this. So that's it really. We've applied a human-centered lens to XR cybersecurity. So I hope that in future we'll work with psychologists, etc., and more human-centered designers and cybersecurity professionals as we go forward. Does anyone have any questions?
Yeah, thank you. Yeah. Are there any questions? Yeah, one, yeah, two, yeah.
Thanks for that. That was really interesting. You're talking about having these attacks happening in sort of the virtual reality world. Have you looked or sort of considered the possibility of these attacks then actually entering sort of the real world? Say, for example, like if you got like say a mosh pit at a concert, and if people are wearing sort of virtual reality headsets, and an incident in that triggers a physical reaction where people start like causing a stampede and things like that, but there's been no sort of physical attack, but it's the perception that's caused
Absolutely.
onset.
Yeah, so that's really in those navigation interventions to cause like a physical movement. So in that context, it would be an AR mixed reality headset that people could be wearing. And absolutely, if a digital overlay is placed into that environment where they think somebody has got a gun, and if you've got even a couple of people in the crowd wearing these headsets, that could be enough to cause some kind of stampede. So one of the images we had was, for example, the protest, etc., and that just going awry. So yes, so that first workshop that we did, which was with academia, we particularly focused on the interreality attacks. It's a space no one's really looking at that much, but it's a space that I'm particularly concerned with. How can attacks from that occur in these platforms spread basically to reality?
Hi, Moya. Thanks for a great talk. You mentioned that some people don't want to report. Have you looked into why?
If we get some more funding, yeah, we will be running some studies on that. So that's why I was developing the Python game. So I can look at the difference between the data that we're gathering sort of in a real context, like web interface context, and then in virtual reality as well, to see if there's different motivators. Yeah.
Oh, okay.
Sorry.
Yeah, a lot of questions.
We get a lot of questions.
Yeah. Maybe quick question, okay? Quick.
Yeah, Nick Moss from Queensland Police. Have you thought about working with government?
We'd love to. Is government interested? I mean, we know you are, but it's about figuring out those pathways and how to work together.
Yeah, because I'd like to explore it, because from the perspective of the double-edged sword of AI for us, it's what we can do internally, but it's also what could happen to us. And yeah, you've got a very good start there in terms of some of the discussions we've been having. So yeah.
Absolutely.
Thank you.
Hey, so is it within your scope to also look at violations of, say, intellectual property and stuff like that viewed through virtual reality?
That's the second paper. Yes, absolutely. So there's a paper in development which is particularly focused at data privacy and data sovereignty, and I'm expanding that taxonomy of harms to be able to include exactly that point. I'm particularly concerned as we head toward the Olympics as well, about cultural IP. Right? Developing protocols for the development of cultural IP in this space, because with AI models, as we know, their ability to commodify culture will be enhanced.
Yeah, awesome.
Thank you. Just maybe offline, yeah.
Hi, I think one of the questions I had was really around the use of the term cybersecurity versus cyber safety. Do you see there's a difference in those, or do you use those synonymously, those two terms?
We've talked about which field we particularly are making the biggest contribution to, and I think I think it's a conversation that the industry kind of really needs to be having. You know, security, and I've said it kind of in a draft paper, is so focused on the IT and the networks, etc. And we really need to focus on that. This is people that are harmed in these environments. So I think you're right, and we've talked at length about what is the right term for this. You know, that's why we talked about, do we call it XR social cybersecurity? But we still want to reinforce the need to work with cybersecurity in this space. I think it's a big conversation.
Yeah, thanks. Thanks to the speaker again. Yeah. Is there Stefan? Oh, you're here. Okay. Okay, yeah, Dr. Stefan Bowman is a senior research fellow at the school, Queensland Digital Health Center, and also School of EECS. Please join me in welcoming him.
Yeah, good. Thank you. Thank you much for this kind introduction. And yeah, thank you for UQ Cyber to fund this project. It's about privacy preserving federated deep learning for medical imaging. Before I get started, acknowledge traditional owners of the land, and a quick introduction. So deep learning, we all know, requires huge amounts of data. So here, a recent example, it's a segment anything model that Meta released. It uses more than 1 billion masks, so labels for subsections and images. And as a base level, it used 11 million images to train this good model. In this case, they used privacy respecting images and licensed images. So actually send photographers out to take photos, and then they license them and they publicly release them. So now the problem is medical imaging, we can't really do that, right? So we can't just take patients' data and put it publicly on the web, even if we remove, for example, the face information. There could still be information in brain structure that could re-identify people, and it's always like medical data. So it's really, really tricky to build actually big models that, for example, segment brain structures. And here on the right, we have our 7 Tesla scanner at the Center for Advanced Imaging, so you know where these images come from. So people lie on this bed, they have a cage over their head, which basically is an antenna, and that receives signals from the body, and then we can reconstruct images from this. And for this, we use deep learning really on all ends for reconstructing these images, but also for segmenting these images. And it's really a very important tool for us. So now then people always ask me, well, isn't privacy really easy, right? You just do federated learning. You just have a couple of hospitals, you put a server at every hospital, and then everything will be safe. Because the pairization of this gradient optimization should help to preserve the privacy. Well, the problem is that this global model that we build in a federated or traditional federated learning approach is still susceptible to information leakage, even with privacy-preserving techniques such as differential privacy, secure multi-party computation, or homomorphic encryption. So because you're building this global model, you can still retrieve some information. So let me show you, before I show these texts, let me just show you how the traditional federated learning would look like. So basically, we have these local training data sets. So you can think every one of these boxes is a hospital. Then there we have these MRI scanners in every hospital, and we build this local parameter, local gradients, and we push these gradients via privacy preserving techniques to a global model, and we pull parameters from this global model. And then the idea would be that all of these models the data can't be leaked from these models, but unfortunately that's not true. So let me show you 2 of these attacks. So one of them is tracing. And this is also known as a membership inference attack. And it means we can infer if a particular data record was included in the training. So now you think, is this really bad? Well, imagine you have a patient data set that was released in one data set, and then you have a model where you can now prove that this patient was part of that model that was used for training. That could be really bad, because then you could, for example, figure out, let's say someone has depression, and then that could have really implications for all kinds of things, and it really breaches their privacy. So that's not good. So we don't want that if we use patient data, we can later identify who was part of that model when we release the model. And the other attack is reconstruction attacks. What we can do is we can infer attributes of the records in this training set. So we can really actually reconstruct some of the data. And I'll show these reconstruction attacks because I think they're quite impressive. First, to me, that they actually work and how well they work. This is from a paper where they exploited the magnitude invariant loss, which basically uses optimization strategies that are known from adversarial attacks. And with these attacks, they can reconstruct images just based on this parameter gradient. And here we see the original image from the validation set. And then this is a reconstruction from purely the gradients of a ResNet. So ResNet 18, which was trained on ImageNet. And we can basically, from these parameters, we can reconstruct which training data set went in there. And now the federated learning would say, well, we are aggregating a lot of gradients. So here, for example, in this example, they used a batch of 100 images. So you would think like, how can you possibly reconstruct data when you aggregated all of that? And they show in that paper that for most of these gradients, for most of these 100 images, they couldn't reconstruct it, but there were like 6 or 7 images in that whole batch where they actually could reconstruct it really, really well. So you see, it's a lot harder because you lose a lot of information, but unfortunately, for some of the cases, it was still possible. So when we look at these membership inference attacks, if we just look at black box inference attacks, which the attackers don't have access to the training and they can't be part of the training. There we saw that overfitted models are more susceptible than generalized models. So if you train a model on a big data set, you should be fine. So and this is what they show as well in this paper. This is a DenseNet model of a CIFAR 10 data set. And this is a big data set. So this is a really nice and general model. And there you only get like 54% inference attack accuracy, and 50% is guessing. So this is really okay. So for black box inference, we're probably okay. Now the problem is if we have access, and the problem is the stochastic gradient descent algorithm is very vulnerable there because every training data set leaves like a little footprint on these gradients. There, if we have a centralized model, they already achieved 74%. And now, if we're looking in federated learning, this is also pretty bad. They're in passive attacks. So this just means you're part of the training, but you're not starting manipulating the training. So here, if you're just participant of the training, so for example, one of the hospitals, you could still get an accuracy of 72% to identify someone in the data set. But if you're the parameter server, so if you're that central model, you actually can get close to 80%. And now the problem is if you even have active attacks on this, so this means you start manipulating the gradients, you start pushing strange data to the server, then you can get even higher. So that's pretty much a worst case estimate here. So now there is a solution to this, and this was developed here at UQ from Ryan's group, and Yanyun Zhang is the first author. So in this project, we partnered together and said, okay, let's see if we can take this idea that they built and take that to medical imaging. So here the idea in confined gradient descent is there's actually not a sharing of a central global model. Every participant in this case has a confined model. And the way it works is we have our local training data set in that hospital. And then instead of sending these model parameters, what we do is we just send these gradients. So basically all of these model gradients are collected here and are securely added and then sent back to this local model. And now this local model is updated and then refined. So basically every site develops their own model, and this model is not shared, and only these parameter updates, this is where it's aggregated. And with this, you can also learn a really good model that's distributed, but it doesn't have this problem of this information leakage. So what we did is, and this proof of concept is, we implemented this confined gradient descent for an MRI segmentation task. And we have another problem in medical imaging is we don't not just have these 11 million images, but we also don't have these 11 billion masks. So we have a lack of label data because doctors are very busy and labeling these things are very difficult. So what we did is to get more training data here is we added a self-supervised learning technique, which is called AutoSeg. And the way it works is we take an image. So here we simulated with brain tumors because it's a nice, easy example. So we took an image without a brain tumor, then we simulate a brain tumor. So we basically have a mask. We know where we put this brain tumor in. We simulate a brain tumor, we add it, and then we can train. And it's purely synthetic data. It just helps us to get over the first hump, basically to get a model started. And then we can refine it with real data. And that's what we did. So we simulated 5 clients that jointly train a segmentation task. And every client selects an unannotated MRI scan, inserts this tumor. And here we see that again. So we have this label, then we have a texture that we apply, and we have a brain scan without a tumor, and then we insert that tumor here. And then we also have real training data with real tumors that we can then use to refine our model. Then we use this confined gradient descent method. Exactly what I described. So each client initializes their own model. The gradient is then computed on the local data and model. Then this gradient is shared with the central server, and only an aggregated gradient update is sent out to all clients. And then every client uses the same gradient step for an update, computes a new gradient step, and then continues. So this is what we got. We start with the self-supervised learning with AutoSeg. And here you see that at the beginning, it really helps. It learns something. So pretty much the first 400 epochs we learned with the simulated data. And then it saturated at one point where you're not getting better because the simulated data is limited in the accuracy and what you can see. And then for the last epochs, we used real data to train. And then you see we get a much better model there. And the cool thing is what we saw is that this confined gradient descent performs very similar to a simple federated averaging technique, which is really nice. And also it performs very similar to a centralized model. So that was good for us to see. It actually works really well, and it works on our test case as well. And then, yeah, basically the discussion and conclusion is it works, which is probably not so surprising, but actually implementing it, testing it, making it work on data wasn't that trivial. We also worked with an industry partner to get this onto MRI scanners. So implementing all of that was part of that project. And also what we learned here is that the self-supervised learning technique can really help us to get started with limited amount of training data. So now where are we taking this now? The next step is that we want to bring neuroimaging software, including these COQ or federated learning algorithms, to all researchers on all computing platforms. And for this, we use software containers. So this is a project I started a couple of years ago, which is called NeuroDesk. And we basically have a community that builds software containers, includes models in there. We distribute them through a container library through Linux, Mac OS, cloud computing, Windows, HPC clusters, pretty much everywhere. And then people can use that. Now, the challenge for clinical translation is this works really well for researchers, right? Downloading a software container and running this on an HPC. But for clinical translation, we need actually more. So we already know the privacy aspect is very important. But we also need, if we run these models, we need to have quite an efficiency in this model. So we have a client-server communication latency. And often we don't have GPUs in hospitals. So often we just have CPUs. We need to run these things. We need to optimize our models. And we saw that in the talk this morning, that this is actually not that trivial. There's lots of errors when you optimize models. And then also usability, because you can't give a doctor like a terminal. They just run away, and rightly so. So we need to make these things really nice to use, really easy to use, really robust, efficient, and privacy aware. So our aim is to create a platform that has these integrated deep learning models that runs inference and training client side on any hardware efficiently. So not necessarily needing a GPU. For this, we need to optimize these models quite heavily. We're working on visualization for a wide range of these medical imaging formats because we need to run these models and look at what come out of this. And then we need to protect confidential patient data. So now with this confined gradient descent, we can do this really nicely. And here, to deploy these models now on browsers of clinicians, but also on the MRI scanner. So that's quite cool. We use the same framework to get onto our target machines. We use Onyx, which basically is a framework where we can take our models from TensorFlow and PyTorch. We can translate it into Onyx, and then we have an Onyx runtime that then gives us this capability to run in browsers through WebAssembly. And also it allows us, it has a C++ interface. So with this, we can run actually on the medical device itself. And here we see that this actually works quite well. The performance inference is quite nice, and that's even without optimizations yet. And for usability, we're using an open source JavaScript library, NewView, which gives us these 3D rendering capabilities in the browser. And this is really nice and user-friendly. And our goal is to run this all nicely secure in the sandbox of the browser. So the data actually, when they run inference, it doesn't leave the hospital, it stays locally in the hospital. And we can run securely inference on these models. And then we can also take part in these federated learning approaches. But this is our step to get this interface into the hand of clinicians. And that's how this prototype currently looks like. So this completely runs in a browser, and we see this now. There's a brain scan loaded in 3 dimensions. And we just started a deep learning model that will segment stuff in the brain, and we will see the outcome in a bit. So this is running in real time in this video. So it takes a couple of seconds, but now the prediction arrived from the model. But the cool thing is the data never left the computer. The model was local. The model ran locally on a CPU on a clinician's computer. And that's how we want to get these things out. So yeah, with this, I thank you for your application, for your attention. And I'm looking actually for collaborations for project and grant applications. So if you're interested in continuing secure federated learning, or software container security is a problem we're facing, and client-side processing in browsers using WebAssembly, making that secure, guaranteeing that no other process can access the data. So if you're interested in any of this, definitely approach me. I'm super happy to work on that. And we have industry partners in that space who are very keen and very interested. So with this, I thank you very much. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Question? Any question?
Thank you for a nice presentation. You mentioned that DP or NPC, which is a variation of zero knowledge proof, is not applicable in this area because they can also leak information. My question is that what are the problems with zero knowledge proof? Because these sorts of applications, it is most commonly used. So what type of information exactly leaked if we are using zero knowledge proof?
Okay, so I'm not 100% sure if that's correct, but I think confined gradient descent, you can basically get the same guarantees as for differential privacy, for example. So you can also, I think Ryan might correct me there, but you can basically compute your security guarantee also with confined gradient descent. So as I'm aware, you can make that work as well. So for example, NVIDIA is using differential privacy. So I think it works as well. I'm just, not sure if there's a fundamental problem. Yeah, exactly. So it works as well. Yeah, I think that's probably the answer.
Okay.
Yeah, exactly. So differential privacy, I think, yes, you compromise a lot on your performance. So you need a lot more data. I think that's the downside. And that's why confined gradient descent helps us in this case, because we don't have a lot of data. I think that's probably the better. I think it's not compromising on security.
Okay, so one thing is that for multi-party computations, so it's not suitable for resource constrained nodes. So is it the case here also that the algorithm most probably would be run in like sensors of the devices which are not powerful?
Exactly. So that's exactly the problem. Exactly. So the hospitals usually, they don't have big GPU racks. So we're very constrained in terms of data and resources. And that's probably the main problem. Yes. And that's why we can't do differential privacy so easily. Yes. But if you have a lot of things and also multi-party computation. Yes.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Any other question? Okay. Yeah. I have one question. So have you thought about poison attack?
Poison attacks. So as an attacker on these models, so to make models worse on purpose, basically. Yes, I definitely thought about it, but I don't think there is a mitigation. Well, there is. So we have a deep learning, we have a federated learning framework in our community which we use. And what they do is they actually, when you submit a segmentation back to the server, it checks if that segmentation is complete garbage. And if it is, it will not be used in the training. So yes, because people have done that. And it happens even like unintentionally. People just segment the wrong thing, just not knowing, and they check it again. So when we do this federated learning, we actually give them stuff we already know what it is, just to check if the segmenter knows what they're doing. And with this, we try to prevent these things. So we didn't call them poisoning attacks, just not good data. But I think that's probably.
Yeah, it's hard to say that this is a data has integrity or data is a poison, right?
Yes.
You only know that accuracy.
Exactly. Yes. So yes, I think that's something very crucial you need to do, because otherwise your model just gets worse if you're accepting bad data. Yes. So we need to make sure that this is not affecting our model. Yes.
So one clarification question. So what local model standard do the one? Segmentation what? Oh, what? So typically if you use it as a classification problem, then the gradient can be sent. That is aggregated at the central server. Then you have a better model. This one, so segmentation information is sent from local to the global. Then what type of information is sent?
Yes,
it's
no,
not
we're
very
also
clear.
sending these gradients. So yes, we're not sending segmentations. Yes,
Okay.
exactly. So we're also sending the gradients. We do the same thing. Yeah.
Okay. So so in other data set, for example, ImageNet or Cypher 10 and MNIST, they have a somewhat standard data sets. Is the same in this medical image, or they are different?
We have a couple of standard data sets. I would say we have this BRETS, which is this tumor data set, which we used to test it here. We have a couple others. There's so many applications in medical imaging, and that's I think also the challenge for us. We don't have one big data set where we could train these models. We have like 200 subjects, 200 scans for one data set. And then we have like liver tumor or prostate tumor or brain tumor, or we have lesion segmentation data sets, but they're all like in a couple hundreds. So there's nothing big as ImageNet, because that's the good thing with computer vision. It's quite simple. It's like naturalistic images, but medicine is so difficult. It's basically only special cases. Like there's no general thing that we could build up to have a big database. And that's, I think, also one of the challenges, like this really lack of training data.
Excellent. Yeah. Thank you. Thank you very much for your talk. Yeah. The third speaker in this session is Rocky Chen. Okay, stage is yours.
Thank you. Cool. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm just going to start with a quick introduction about myself. I'm Rocky Chen. I'm currently a lecturer with the data science discipline at UQ. So yeah, thanks for this opportunity to share with everyone what we have done with the support of UQ's CyberSeed funding. As you may have seen already from the title here, what we are doing is called Cybersecurity Defense Strategies of Distribution Synchron Phaser in Smart Grids. So a lot of confusing and unfamiliar keywords for, I think, the majority of people sitting here today, but don't worry about it. I will unfold those keywords one by one in the following part of my talk today. So actually, we have 3 more team members. So basically, the project that sits at the intersection of cybersecurity, data science, and the power systems. So basically, we are using power systems as the test bed and the actual application for the methodology we have developed here. Okay, cool. Let me simply start with some very brief information about the background and a bit of the research motivation. So the power systems or electrical systems or electrical networks, whatever you want to call them, they are getting increasingly complex nowadays, right? We are seeing more renewable energy plugged into the power systems. We are seeing more smart meters being installed in the power system. So the proper control and monitoring for this kind of modern power systems have become very, very crucial. And in order to do that, we must supply the control system with very accurate data collected from the real time when the power systems are operating. And to facilitate that, I'm just trying to find my mouse. Okay. Yeah, usually to facilitate accurate data acquisition, the traditional hardware or the device is called this supervisory control and the data acquisition. So on the left-hand side, SCADA for short. Usually these are relatively cost-effective to manufacture, so you can actually deploy a high number of these in the power system for data collection, but they do come with some defects. There are very limited information can be collected by SCADA. And the biggest defect, I would say, is the low data resolution. Basically, the sampling ratio is around just 1 sample per second. Not very ideal, not very impressive in today's big data world. So there is a need for better data collection mechanisms, right? So on the right-hand side, we were seeing, newer devices. These are called phasor measurement unit, PMU for short. Compared with SCADA, the biggest advantage of PMU would be its high resolution. So down the bottom of this slide, you will be able to see a quick comparison of the data collected by those two devices. The blue line is the data collected by SCADA. So compared with the data collected by PMU that can go as 30 samples per second, the SCADA's data is not as fine-grained as PMU's data, and it has actually omitted a lot of details, a lot of very subtle patterns within the power system. And there are two general types of PMUs currently used in the power system industry. So the UPMU, which is the standalone version of it. And for that, it is GPS synchronized, so you will be able to tell where the data comes from. But because it is the standalone version, it is not that movable, so it comes with limited number when doing the deployment. Then there is another variant on the right-hand side, the PMU function embedded in protection devices. You can think of that as the IoT version of PMUs. Because they are cheaper, they are easier to deploy, they come with higher numbers, and they naturally inherit the advantages of the PMU devices, very high resolution, and they are GPS synchronized. So enough about what PMU is. Then, here is the current situation of PMU deployment in Australia. So our leading team member, he actually initiated and led the collaboration with our industrial partner, Noja Power Intelligence Switchgear. And from 2017 to 2021, Noja Power have launched the project Arena, which resulted in 100 units of PMU devices deployed in Queensland and Victoria, which supports the GPS-based time synchronization and collects PMU data consisting of a lot of different attributes, the voltage, the current, the phase angle, etc. And this supports the real-time data streaming with continuous time series. The best part of it is the device comes with really high precision, so supports up to 50 data points per second, which is really impressive for real-time use. And given the system, given the common use of PMU for power system control and monitoring, the challenge, from the cyberspace, especially from the cybersecurity perspective, is actually motivated by two factors. So first thing is the PMUs provide real-time monitoring and faster control of power networks. So a lot of real-time data is generated and collected and will be analyzed to facilitate real-time decision-making. So in this context, if you have, high throughput power system with real-time data, It forces us to kind of, revisit the current communication protocols of the standard PMUs. But unfortunately, the standard PMU communication protocols, they lack the security mechanism and are vulnerable to data integrity attacks. So I will quickly show you what I mean with this picture. Basically, it describes, how PMU data is collected and analyzed in the real world. Basically, after synchronizing with the GPS, PMU sends data to a relay point, which is usually called the data concentrator. And it aggregates data from different PMUs and sends that to the control center to facilitate the subsequent decision-making. And this is where things might potentially go wrong. So if data is aggregated by a not so trusted data concentrator, or if the data gets intercepted and polluted during the transmission process, for example, we see some data spoofing attack, which may modify a segment of the data to make the integrity of the entire piece of data affected, then it will, have some catastrophic results, right? So it may lead to incorrect control action. It, may have some worse consequence from the data spoofing attack. So as a result, you may see the instability of the power system, or even the protection failure of the power system, which are not the consequences we would like to see in today's world. So with that, we kind of, developed the two major objectives in our research. So first thing is that we would like to review the spatial temporal signatures of PMU measurement. So in the language of data science, we will be doing some data extraction and feature engineering for the spatial temporal data collected by the PMU device. And then with the properly engineered input features, we are trying to leverage them to identify the source locations of PMU data based on different machine learning algorithms. So basically, given a piece of PMU data, we want the algorithm to be able to confidently tell us, where the data comes from. So relates the data with the source PMU. And if you think of that from a different angle, when you are given a piece of data, then the machine learning algorithm has a really low confidence in identifying the source. Then there's a problem, right? The data would be very, very suspicious. And then we take a quick look, at the behavior and the patterns of the real world PMU data. Basically, the data comes from 7 high precision distribution PMUs deployed at Queensland distribution networks. And these locations are basically, categorized by the distance from the central part of Brisbane. And on the right-hand side, there is a quick visualization of 3 locations, 1, 4, 7, marked by different colors. A quick observation from the figure, although they share very, very similar patterns in terms of how they fluctuate, there are very subtle differences as well. And what we are trying to do is to, try to differentiate those subtle differences and try to differentiate the actual source of each piece of PMU data. And then here is how we actually did it in our research. The first part would be, to do some proper feature engineering. We basically did 3 types of features. We used some statistical measures to extract the features: mean value, standard deviation, variation range. These are pretty standard. We also tried to investigate the recurrent nature of the time series data as well. What we have done is to fit the data into the autoregressive model, AR model. Basically, if you have a quick look at the formula, basically the model describes, how the current data at time TI is correlated with the data from one step forward and 2 steps forward, plus some innovative signal, which can be essentially viewed as a bias term in a lot of other different machine learning models. And after fitting the data to the autoregressor, what we use is we take these 2 coefficients and we also calculate the variance of the innovative signal. We use them as our core features for the task. And then Dr. Yi also suggested another approach based on signal decomposition. So what we have used is the wavelet-based method. Basically, it decomposes a function, a wavelet, into a set of sub-wavelets called intrinsic mode function, IMF. And based on the decomposition, we will be able to further derive some other statistics based on the decomposed results. And we use them as a part of our input feature as well. And then a bit more details of how we do this. First thing first, we will need to gather and prepare some data. And basically, when preparing our data, we simply segment the time series into pieces with 20 seconds of the length. And the data split is pretty standard, 60% for training, 40% for testing. And some other very standard pre-processing used as well. We removed some outlier. We also removed some redundant data from the dataset. With the features extracted, we built our prediction method based on the deep forest, which generally uses less parameters than a deep neural network, but can deliver very high quality prediction results as well. And there is a benefit on the efficiency side as well, because deep forest essentially supports parallelization of different decision trees. And we evaluate from 2 major perspectives. So how accurate the identification is. So if we do the identification for 7 PMUs, then it is essentially a classification with 7 possible classes. Then there is the classification accuracy. Then we focus on the efficiency as well. We record the time per sample needed to generate the predicted label. And here we take a quick look at the results we obtained. So 7 days, 1 month, 3 months. So these are actually indicating, the tested data we use comes from 7 days later after, the training data, or 1 month later, or 3 months later. The rationale of doing this is, in the real production environment, you cannot use a fixed algorithm, a trained algorithm forever, right? It needs to be updated. So we want to see how robust, once your algorithm is trained, how long it can stay accurate without being retrained. So this is our key motivation. So first thing first, we are able to obtain the best possible results for different time gap. And one potential area for improvement would be the running time, the inference time. We are now sitting, somewhere in the middle among the baselines. And there are definitely faster variants, but these are not as accurate, right? So we are working on to, some perfect balance between efficiency and accuracy as the next part of our research. We have also tried something interesting. We, modified the length of the data segment we use for evaluation and testify the accuracy. And this is 20. 20 is the default length we stick to when we do the evaluation. And we tried to increase the length from 1 all the way to 60. So basically, there's a general increasing trend. Basically, if you extend the input, you get, more information. It is, natural to get higher accuracy. But the increase after 20 would be minimal. one potential cause would be the average affecting the, signature values. And with that, what we really want to achieve is a perfect balance between, the data we require to achieve a decent accuracy and, the actual performance of the algorithm. Of course, if you use longer, time segment, you will get better performance, but it will take the algorithm longer to produce the prediction as well, which might not be as appealing in a real production environment. So let me quickly summarize with our future step. So with the support of seed funding, we not only resulted in 2 publications, but also come up with this vision of how we will be implementing that for real world application. So PMU data will be gathered and collected by a measurement archive called Open Historian. And originally, without any authentication step, it will directly come through the Historian Python API and get stored in the database. Now we are simply adding an additional branch, basically adding this source identification, or what do we call the authentication step. So it will run in parallel and become a part of the data to be stored in the database. And then the stored data will be able to be demonstrated, be visualized through some other interfaces, for example, the Grafana, for real-time data analysis, result visualization, and some other human in the loop computing as well. Okay, this is all for my presentation on our research. Happy to share this with you. A quick acknowledgement on the great support by UQ's seed funding and also our industrial partners. Yeah, thank you very much.
Thank you. Question? Yeah.
Thanks for a very interesting talk. Did you have any troubles with time synchronization? Because this is spread out over quite a large geographical area with different communication paths. How do you time synchronize all the different PMUs?
Basically, to be honest, for my part, we don't really concern about time synchronization. So data comes into our archive as processed, as synchronized. And so I reckon in the preparation stage of the data, the synchronization will be a really key issue. And this is especially true if you intend to run any kind of real world simulation. Yeah, that will be a very key step to take.
Yep, yeah, good. And one other question: have you experimented with whether you can detect faked GPS data? If an attacker puts in a wrong GPS location, are you able to detect that?
We haven't tried, any attacks on the GPS information, the location information. What we mainly focus on would be, all the signals, voltage, current data collected by the PMUs themselves. Yeah, but that would be a really nice point to add to our, existing outcome. Yeah.
Thank you.
Any other questions? I have one question about this one.
Yeah.
Okay, first, what's the main cause of that? The accuracy dropped gradually if you have a longer month, right? It's a month, right? 1 month and it's 3 months, then the accuracy drops.
Yeah.
The main cause of.
Very good question. So basically, our model is trained with, maybe today's data, and in the 7-day setting, we are doing predictions, for data coming in 7 days later, and similar with 1 month and 3 months. Yeah, the data is constantly changing because it can be impacted by a lot of real world factors, how people living in that area are using electricity, how electricity are distributed in the real time. Yeah, what's the control strategy in that period of time? Yeah, so basically a model trained with a specific period of time's data will be only dedicated for that time intervals pattern. Yeah, so it will be less capable of capturing future trends. So, and this is exactly reflected by our experimental results. Yeah, so with that, we are simply trying to suggest, what is the possible life cycle of your machine learning algorithm for this kind of anomaly detection. Yeah, and yeah, our quick conclusion is, there is a need for some frequent updates. Yeah, otherwise it won't stay as accurate.
Yeah, one more question is about the when you do the maybe filtering of the data or cleansing of data,
yeah,
you remove that abnormal data or maybe outliers, right?
Yeah.
But actually, in reality, that there are some abnormally, right?
Yeah.
Abnormal behaviors or maybe
Yeah, definitely.
anomalies, right?
Yeah.
Because suddenly the electricity level goes up in the PMU. How do you deal with that? Do you consider that as abnormal or that's actually happening? How do you deal with that?
Yeah, this is a really good question. So basically what we remove, so the, abnormal data points we identify from the data set will be really trivial anomalies. So basically, so in at a time point, you see a dramatic increase of the voltage value, which is definitely not realistic. So with a simple thresholding method, you can easily remove that. No problem. And what we are more focused here in this research would be, the harder to detect the cyber attacks. Yeah, because sometimes the attackers not necessarily generating, false data by themselves. They are copying a segment of the data from a real PMU, but a different one, and paste that into the target PMU. Yeah, then it will become really tricky for detection. Yeah, it won't, the voltage, for example, falls in the normal range, but, it will need some machine learning algorithms to be detected in that case.
Maybe I misunderstood one thing that you said that you use the 7 PMU. Right?
Yeah, 7.
Then there's gonna be 7 class problems. Is that true?
Yes.
Okay,
yes.
is that true? My understanding is correct.
Yeah, correct.
What if we have 100 PMU across the different area?
Yeah.
Then do you group them together or is it 100 classification problems?
Yeah, that's a very good question. So in that regard, for the sake of efficiency, a more reasonable approach is to do a hierarchical classification.
Okay.
So basically, we can firstly classify by region, then we classify by identity.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you very much. Yeah. Thank
Thanks.
you. So the last, but not least speaker is Professor Janet Willis. Sorry for keep you waiting for a long time. Yeah. So we deserve the best one all the way at the end, always. Yeah. Yeah. Thank you. Thank you for your patience. Yeah.
Maybe go back to the beginning.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, please go ahead. Yeah.
Thank you. So this is an interdisciplinary project, as Ryan said, and I'd like to highlight in particular the work of Bill Bingley, who's the postdoc who's been working on this. It's bringing together 4 different faculties. My role in this, I'm a computer scientist who strayed into a psychology department for her postdoc, and I'm back in EECS now. My current focus is human-centered AI. So I work between humans and technology, and in particular language technologies. And as a language technologist, I particularly like to acknowledge that we meet on the lands of the Turrbal and Yagara peoples. The languages, Turrbal and Yagara here, pay my respects to elders past and present. And I want to say that we have lots of different ways of identifying ourselves. I have a lanyard that lets me into my office, into my building. Human cultures have always used identity devices. And I don't know if you know the history of welcome to country and acknowledgement of country. I was listening to the accents. We come from all over the world. personally, I come from south of the border, so I'm a foreigner as well. There are many First Nations in Australia. When you travel, go back a couple of hundred years, when you travel from nation to nation, you might be following a songline, you might be going to ceremony, a festival, on walkabout. You are crossing other people's lands, and you would stop at the border and you'd wait until you were welcomed onto country, like you would stop at someone's front door until someone welcomes you in. So when you're a visitor, you would acknowledge the custodians of those lands. That's why I acknowledge country, whereas my Aboriginal colleagues who come from Meanjin, from this land, would welcome you to country. Now, language tech, I get to do really exciting things. I attended a Yugambeh language course. Yugambeh is the language of the land just south of Meanjin. And Sean Powers, an amazing linguist, is speaking Yugambeh, and he was teaching some of it to us. And he talked about the culture as well. One of his ancestors did a lot of cultural business, and he would be moving across lands all the time. How does he identify himself? They're not just going to let anyone move across land. And he would carry a message stick. And the message stick would have a lot of information on it. So it would have his identity. It could have messages carved into it. It gave him safe passage. So it had a role to play as well. So the reason I tell the story is I think message sticks remind us that proving your identity is as old as humanity itself. We've always done this. It provides agency. And I'm going to be talking about older Australians. And what does it do if you require people to define their agency online and they're not online? So traveling online, I think, shares a lot of similarities with traveling through different nations. We are traveling through different spaces online. So identity, our identity is not just our online identity. When we talk about digital identities, it's actually the interaction between the online and the physical that really matters. So I want to ask everyone here, how safe do you feel from identity fraud when you're online? Okay, please put up your hand if you feel more safe than unsafe. On average, do you feel more safe than unsafe? I've got a few. How many people feel more unsafe than safe? Yeah, neutral. Yeah, there's a few neutral. Okay, so we've got a scattering. It might be in this group, probably, 40, 40, 20 and those numbers. So this seed project is interested in the situation for people who are not typically privileged. And I would say everyone in this room and everyone online is privileged in the sense that we have access to devices, we have access to knowledge. We work with people who can tell us if we don't know. There are people we can talk to at work, in our labs, in our families. So I'm going to define the terms that we use in this. A digital identity. Now, this term is defined in many different ways. We're using a very simple term because we're talking with older people. So who you are online, it could include things like documentation accounts, social media. Some people divide it into two broad categories, your digital attributes and your digital activities. We're not really asking people at that level of detail. Your secure digital identity is a definition we need to look at. We use the term lanyard because it's a very concrete thing for enabling specific access to your online identity. And then when we talk about older Australians, we're using the Australian Institute of Health and Welfare definition. So we're taking people 65 and older in these studies. The questions that we're working with, and I should say this is research currently in progress. First question, research question, what are older Australians' attitudes towards, experiences with, and thoughts about digital identity security? And how can older Australians' digital identities be secured without compromising their well-being in other ways. And I should say in some of the other projects I do, one of the other projects is building technologies for people living with dementia at home, where people would like to put all of their personal information online, accessible to themselves. And as the disease degenerates, give access to it to different people. So we've been doing a lot of work in this area for the last 5 years, but now we're going to talk to Australians who are not part of university projects. So what I'm going to talk about is 3 parts of the studies we're doing at the moment. We're doing an online survey, individual interviews, and a systematic lit review. So I don't know how many people know about Qualtrics panels. Qualtrics make survey design software. It's often used by researchers in the behavioral sciences. They can also collect data via panels for an extra cost. And it's a very quick survey, 15-minute survey. We did a panel of 453 Australians aged 65 plus. This is stratified by gender, roughly 50-50, by state, rough population, reflecting the populations. And we didn't specify location, but actually metropolitan, rural, and remote, about 70-31% is around about reflecting the Australian population. The rates of smartphone ownership. Now, this was an online survey, so we would expect a lot of people to be digitally literate. So smartphone ownership, 92%, slightly higher for men, slightly lower for women. And home internet access, again, slightly higher for men, slightly lower for women. I'm not going to go through all of our results. These are preliminary results from, we're analysing the data at the moment. So most older Australians have been required to send personal information online. And I think many of us have had that experience. How many people here have heard of or know about MyGovID? Anyone who gets their tax information from, government ID potentially is using it. Those numbers were quite high in this group. It was 34% in this older group, and they do a lot of interaction with government if they need to. So that number's a really interesting number to look at. Older Australians are frequently the target of online scams. When you look at 51%, that seems low to me, because most of the people I know have been the target, but not necessarily succumbed to it. So this is not asking how many people have actually been impacted. Then we asked how many were impacted: financial harm, 1/3 of those, psychological harm, 1/6 of those. So a bit more than 1/3 of Australians feel more unsafe than safe. The last 3 points, the points highlighted here, I don't know if you can tell the colours purple. Older, more remote, and female participants report being less aware about digital identity security practices. They feel less safe online, and they're less likely to have digital infrastructure. And we are suggesting what's emerging from our data is that potentially these groups are at higher particular risk. Awareness of digital identity practices. So ID services, 2-factor biometric authentication was associated with feeling safer online. So it's important to know who knows about them, who feels comfortable using them, and who, knowing and feeling comfortable, then does go on and use them. Older Australians more frequently receive help proving their identity online, not from their neighbours and friends, but from government officials. And this last point was one that surprised us, because we were expecting that people would go to people who they know. But if you know fiercely independent older people, until the system crashes in a heap, they're going to try and do everything they can themselves. And this is something that I think is really important. Looking at it from a government point of view is, how do we support older Australians in their access to this kind of information? We are doing a deep dive through interviews. The Qualtrics survey was people who have access to digital technology. We want to be able to access the people who don't. So we're doing 20 targeted, deep, semi-structured interviews, 30 to 60 minutes, either in person, by phone, however people would like to be contacted. I'm not going to go through all of these results, but there's a whole series of codes that are coming out of this. This is very detailed, deep data, convenience, problems with tech, anxiety, infrastructure, participation, where people get their help. And then we've got self-blame. A lot of people, if they have been scammed, blame themselves. And the bottom one here, again, it's highlighted just because I think it's a really interesting one, is the embarrassment. And this is something that I think is emerging anecdotally and also potentially in a number of studies. Why don't people seek redress when they've been scammed? Why don't they talk to their friends? Why don't they tell their family? It's a bit frustrating and it's a bit embarrassing that you've fallen for it. And I know when my friends have told me that they've been scammed, it's always at a quiet moment, potentially when we're, having a drink, or it's never in a formal, open situation with a lot of people. Embarrassment and how we manage things like cyber fraud is a really critical social phenomena to understand. Okay, what our older Australians want from us, these are emerging themes: education, website accessibility, help from people, systems that make the user feel confident and safe. I guess these are not necessarily things that would surprise us, but it's useful to know where to place our focus to get the most impact as we do this work. The third thing we're doing is a systematic literature review. This is in progress. I don't know how many people have done one of these. You start with a question. So ours is techniques and practices for maintaining digital identity security for older people. So it's got to be a technique and practice. It's got to be about digital identity, and it's got to be about older people. And so we had a whole stack of keywords, searching through databases, came out with 908 articles, which we went through and found 147 are relevant, and currently doing data extraction from that. Where next? Outputs, we're working on a report with KPMG, who are our partner in this, due in several months. We're working on a submission to the CHI, which is a top computer human interaction conference, and the systematic review paper, which we're working towards the end of the year to get that finished. We're working on an ARC linkage proposal. We would really like to conduct research, similar research with other groups. So I've been in touch with a local Indigenous company who would like to be able to train Indigenous workers in our methodology to go out to communities and do similar sorts of studies. And this is the kind of thing that I think would be really valuable, because we have this huge rise, not just in Indigenous businesses, but in a lot of Indigenous people who need to access technologies online. The other part, which is just a last slide here, we need to develop better models of humans for developers that include not just the user as a single individual, but the user as part of a social system, as part of social dynamics. And one of the things our group, this is a 10-author paper that has just come out, is enlarging the model of the human at the heart of human-centered AI. We call it the social self-determination model of AI system impact. And this is particularly where we're looking at the impact of AI on individuals. And out of this project, we're now developing a scale with the psychologists to be able to let people try and estimate the impact from their own systems. Let me finish by take-home message. It's increasingly assumed that older Australians can and should live their lives online, but it's not so easily done. How can we manage that? I've mentioned embarrassment. I mentioned human-centered design for digital identity. And if you're interested, I'm up to my 15 minutes. Please talk to me or others in the team. Thank you.
Any question? Yeah.
Thank you for that presentation. In one of the earlier slides, I think you mentioned about, I think during the survey, about whether elderly felt they had been targeted. Did you differentiate between a targeted attack and say perhaps like a phishing or were those considered one and the same where people felt that even receiving a scam that they'd been targeted in that attack?
Oh, okay. This is a use of terminology. We weren't asking, did you feel personally targeted? We were just asking, have you had a scam attack? And of the people who had been targeted, we use targeted in that sense. So the statistics weren't drilling into specific targeting, but this is an area where older people are a huge honeypot that have certain vulnerabilities that probably need additional attention.
Okay.
Thank you for the question.
Yeah, Nick Mills from Queensland Police. I'm pretty much on the cusp of the elderly, and my generation and the people around me did grow up with computers and have got some literacy compared to those on the other end of the scale. So I wonder what's going to happen to this cohort, because as we get older, more and more will be coming in that'll be more literate and things like that. So I'm wondering whether there'll be changes in the research, the literature, the thing, and secondly, this human in the loop or the AI that's going on. There's a lot of interest in that, and just today I've been aware of 3 or 4 different things in different areas of UQ going on, and I don't know if we're talking to each other. So it'd be very interesting to see how some of this work can come together even within the one university.
Yeah, I think that's great. And I've learned a lot about what's going on at my university as well. Thank you, Ryan. One of the things that I think is really interesting in this space is as people get older, their children and grandchildren are worried about their safety, and they're concerned with AI ethics or security. Money. But what we find is that people aren't necessarily worrying about their own safety or security as much as living their lives well. So not am I at risk when I access my government pension, but can I access my government pension? How do I do it? How do I make my day go better? Is the phrase that came out of our dementia project. Their kids are worried about them falling over. They're worried about living through the day. So I think as we get older, we're still going to have all of those concerns. Yes, I think the technology sophistication changes. We've seen this changing in young children as well. We've done studies in young children that show their technological literacy is different to the generations before them. I think we'll find that with older people, but I don't necessarily think we'll find it's a very different scenario in terms of risk. Yeah.
Any other question? No, I have one question. So you mentioned about the human model. Yeah. What do you mean by that one? Can you elaborate a little bit more? Because to some human that who are not familiar with the online stuff, or is that what you meant? Or yeah, can you elaborate that one a little more?
Okay, so the model of the human. When we think about humans working with tech, the scenario is usually one machine, one phone, one person. How long have you owned your phone? A year, 2 years, maybe a couple of months? How long do you expect to own it? Maybe a year, 2 years. How many people use your phone? How many people use your phone to identify themselves? It's a very common thing we do. But there are a lot of communities in Australia where you own a phone for about 2 weeks on average, and then it gets passed on to the next person. Maybe your uncle needs it, maybe someone else. So the technology we use is not just us individually, or your phone might be used by multiple people in your family, depending on the culture you come from. And we're many cultures in Australia. So what we're doing in this social self-determination model is not just take the individual as an individual, but also think of us as part of many different social settings. So I am a human-centered computing researcher. I'm a member of my school. I am a female academic. I'm a member of my family. I live in St. Lucia. You know, you can say there are all these different cultures that we're part of. If AI throws you into that particular culture, then it can either enhance or not. So if it says, you're someone with dementia, I'm not going to give you access to all of these things, or I'm going to make you feel bad about your use of technology. So it's the individual and the social that is the first dimension that's really critical here, the social. And then within each of those, if we look at what makes an individual, what are the most major concerns we have, it's our own autonomy. Does technology change your autonomy? If you give a medical practitioner a new test, do they have to use it? Because otherwise their insurance will. So have you changed their ability to work the way they want? So there's autonomy, there's competence. If you introduce a new type of technology and someone can't use it, the person who did tech in the family can no longer use it. You've excluded them from their role within the family. So you've got your own competence and your relatedness to those around you can also change. So these are the three big ones individually, and they also come into social interactions as well.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Yeah. Okay. Thank you. Thank you, all the speakers today and also participants. Yeah, that's the end of the session.